Immediately before the Renaissance, you have these huge UFO battles over various European cities. Huge triangular craft, spheres of various colors, attacking each other, some of them falling from out of the sky. What a lot of people are concerned about, including people in the deep state of our own government,
Sure.
is that the bad guys won. In the struggle over reshaping human history, we wound up losing a rebellion against a control system that abides to this day.
Who is actually in the driver's seat when it comes to these sort of scientific paradigm shifts? Who is pumping these ideas through these architects?
The religious control system on the planet.
And so what is that?
This thing is very similar to a thing that's happened in our biblical records where a Lord presented Moses with a pattern to build a tabernacle. They came out of the sky, they handed him stone tablets, and this phenomena that's taking place today is as old as our history.
At the time the Black Plague breaks out, there are many UFO sightings. There are sightings of objects that land in fields.
Mm-hmm.
It was so prominent that hysteria broke out about it in the French court, and Charlemagne was considering declaring war on the tyrants of the air.
3 men and a woman were seen descending from these aerial ships. The entire city gathered about them, saying that they were magicians sent by Charlemagne's enemy to destroy the French harvest.
The plague broke out only after these people would land in the fields, and they would go around with these hoods on and these spray cans, and these guys would walk and deliver door-to-door service, spraying the doors of individual homes, where then the plague would break out.
Well, who are these people?
Exactly. Ingo Swann is being tasked to remote view the moon, and here's what he saw there. He saw tall Nordic people conducting slave labor on the moon. What does that say about who these people are? Number one, it says that they're people.
I went into another room where there was a chair. A man came in while I was trying to find a way out there. And this was a human-looking person. They had passed in a crowd, this individual, and on Earth.
Jason Reza Jorjani, thank you for joining me.
I can't believe I made it into heaven with Jesse Michaels.
I know. What did you think you weren't going to make it? Do you think where do you think you were more of a purgatory guy, or what was your?
Well, I mean, yesterday was definitely purgatory. I tell you, I've flown a lot, and to have 2 airplanes break down,
yeah,
and a 7-hour delay,
yes,
it was a little bit weird.
It's super weird. Well, that's the perfect segue, weirdness in reality, for what I want to cover with you, because I think you're one of the few people who studies UFO history and the nuts and bolts side, but you also kind of understand some of the deeper underpinnings and architecture of what's going on. I think there's like the kind of, it's like the bell curve or something. If you're like kind of really dumb and normie, like you don't think anything's going on. You think it's like all Occam's razor, like, kind of, there's nothing to see here. And then you get into the like middle of the curve. It's like only nuts and bolts. It's like, all just saucers and a hanger. And then once you get deep enough or something, on the right side of the bell curve, its consciousness is somehow extremely fundamental to all of this. And you get into weird stuff around secret societies and psychic warfare, and it gets weird. And so it feels like you are really deep into all of that stuff.
Yeah, one thing I would take exception to in terms of the bell curve analogy there is that I basically agree with what you're saying, except I think that there's a place on the other side of the bell curve from where the normies are, who deny that anything much is going on at all, and then people who, let's say, have read Carl Jung on UFOs and appreciate the extent to which this phenomenon involves the co-constitution of physical reality by consciousness and so on and so forth. There's a place on the other side of that bell curve where someone can, as it were, fall off the deep end. And I think it's also a psychological defense mechanism. You can wind up developing such an abstract meta-interpretation of these phenomena that you're actually occluding or occulting some more tangible aspects of it that are deeply disturbing. And so that acts also, I think, both as a psychological defense mechanism for the particular researcher who may want to interpret this all as like the Kantian thing in itself, which we will never know. And it's like,
yes,
it's intrusions into our reality and our limited frame of interpretation, right, based on human consciousness. The denial of our capacity to ultimately discern what's going on with this phenomenon can also be a way to defer responsibility for dealing with some very tangible things that are going on that are deeply disturbing and that have very serious sociological and political implications.
I couldn't agree more. I think some people who are so far off the deep end in the consciousness realm are there because it's unfalsifiable,
Yeah.
because it's like impossible to study, because it really doesn't even touch our consensus reality. So you don't need to justify it. It turns into its own sort of cult. But you said something very interesting there. You said there's some deeply disturbing things going on in just the kind of more prosaic nuts and bolts, version of the UFO story. What do you mean by that?
Let me come to that in a moment.
Okay.
But before we, scare the bejesus out of the listeners right off the bat, let me give a little bit more historical context for what I was saying.
Yes.
So, without naming names, Kant has become, I think, very important to some people who have taken a very abstract approach to interpreting what's going on with the UAP phenomenon. And if you look at Immanuel Kant's own life, here's a guy, and by the way, I wrote about this in my first book, Prometheus and Atlas. There's a whole chapter where I discuss Descartes and Kant and basically the constitution of the world picture of the Age of Enlightenment, right? And the thing about Kant is that in his youth, he actually took the time and care to read the entirety of Emanuel Swedenborg's Arcana Coelestia, The Secrets of Heaven, which has all kinds of accounts of extraterrestrials living on various planets and different gradations of existence, right, and planes of being and so on and so forth. And there's also, more significantly, a ton about psi abilities in that book, about clairvoyance and telekinesis and so on and so forth. Well, Kant reads all of this, and then he writes the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals in a way that develops an abstraction based on Swedenborg. He's using Swedenborg, but then he's warping the metaphysical structure of Swedenborg's work in order to construct an unknowable reality beyond the veil of appearances that's conditioned by the limits of our own consciousness. And if you read his earliest writings, which he suppressed in his own lifetime, Kant admits that the reason that he did this is that the stuff in Swedenborg is so disturbing that it would destabilize society, including on a political level. So what Kant wants to do is create this metaphysical model that allows him to define what he calls a kingdom of ends, where each human being is an end in himself, a moral agent equal to every other person. And then based on this, he can frame this categorical imperative that you should never use any other person as a means, and every person should be treated as an end in himself, right? It's like the Archimedean point of his whole moral system. Well, he does this by misappropriating and distorting Swedenborg and covering over both the psychic and telekinetic accounts in Swedenborg's writings, and also the accounts of, various forms of extraterrestrial intelligence. And I see the same move being made today in certain sectors of the UAP conversation.
Well, it's fascinating. I mean, that's a great book, Prometheus and Atlas. Everybody should buy it. It's this sort of sweeping philosophical treatise where you go through the advent of empiricism and reason and, the Enlightenment and figures like Kant and Descartes. And in Kant's case, I think you also say that the occult, the reason to keep the occult or sort of separate somehow or off limits is because it would involve a storming of heaven or something. And did he have a political motive in doing this? Because with Descartes, I think you say that he was a Jesuit spy. And maybe
Descartes was literally a Jesuit spy. In other words, Descartes was in the employ of people who were holier than the Pope. In other, that phrase, holier than the Pope? These were agents of the Vatican that were acting against the sort of like status quo modus operandi of the Catholic Church in France. They were like more zealous than the Pope, and they were Jesuits. And they had sent René Descartes to infiltrate the Rosicrucian order and to develop a false scientific paradigm that would reduce everything in the physical world to basically mechanical causality. Which then has the effect of relegating everything that can't be encompassed within a mechanistic grid and framework of interpretation into the realm of the spiritual, which is in the domain of the Catholic Church, right? So then the church gets to continue to have a monopoly on discourse about anything spiritual, and the common citizen is presented with a scientific paradigm that's soul-crushingly nihilistic, so that he will then remain within the arms of the church.
And you think that was Descartes' mission?
Absolutely.
To do that?
Yeah, he was a hired Jesuit agent. I mean, the guy was literally a stormtrooper who functioned as a military intelligence attaché to Catholic armies that were going through Protestant villages and burning them to the ground and, basically engaging in a inquisitory religious war against the Protestants of France. And this is the guy who we trace our modern scientific paradigm to. Now, Kant wasn't, a paid agent of anybody, as far as I can tell. But he definitely had political motivations, right? And the thing is, Kant's political motivations are not something, antiquarian and, only relevant to his own epoch. We still face the same concerns that he did as a serious thinker grappling with evidence for the paranormal. So, for example, as I point out very early on, and, I've come back to this over and over again in the 14 books that I've written, but it's right there in Prometheus and Atlas from the beginning. If you consider what it would mean for telepathy, clairvoyance, telekinesis, or what we call psychokinesis these days, to achieve mainstream scientific recognition, and for large numbers of people to then adopt training protocols for these latent human abilities, right? The way that we have now a lot of the remote viewers offering remote viewing training. Imagine what kinds of social challenges that faces us with, right? I mean, if people become adept telepaths or adept clairvoyants, there's no such thing as privacy left. There's no physical privacy left. Anyone can see you doing whatever you're doing inside the privacy of your own home. Anyone can even step into your mind, like the remote viewers, for example, who were tasked to psychically spy on Saddam Hussein during the first Gulf War, Lynn Buchanan and others. They actually went into Saddam's mind to the extent that, for example, they would get ill when he was ill and so on and so forth. And
yes.
So this is like a horrendous violation of personal privacy. And then when you go to psychokinesis, it's even worse, right? So there's this direct mental influence on living systems that's been studied in a very serious way by parapsychologists. And often what they'll do is they'll visualize certain organic systems in the body with a view to trying to heal diseases using psychokinesis. But obviously, I mean, as the Soviets figured out in the 1970s when they were taking mice down in submarines and trying to stop their hearts, you can use the same thing to kill somebody. I mean, you can use it to give somebody a heart attack or a stroke. And there's evidence, based on the testimony of some of our top remote viewers, that there was a black unit in the United States that was doing these things in the 1970s and 80s. It was separate from the remote viewing programs that were eventually defunded by Congress.
Whoa. As you know, I'm always on the hunt for things that help me stay sharp, focused, and full of energy while I'm diving into life's mysteries and making this show happen. And I've got to say, Mudwater has completely transformed my mornings. Back in the day, I used to struggle with that post-coffee crash. And let's not even get into the caffeine jitters.
Mudwater gave me the smooth, steady energy I was missing. It's packed with functional mushrooms like lion's mane, chaga, and reishi, plus turmeric and cacao, all working together to keep me focused, calm, and grounded. Honestly, it's like coffee went on a yoga retreat and came back zen. What I love most is that it's not just about replacing coffee, it's a whole new ritual. It's a simple, nourishing way to start the day, and I actually look forward to it every morning. Every ingredient is USDA certified organic, vegan, non-GMO, and there's zero sugar. It's energy that doesn't mess with your sleep or make you question your life choices at 3 a.m. Ready to make the switch to cleaner energy? Head to mudwater.com, that's MUDWTR.com, and grab your starter kit today. Right now, our listeners get an exclusive deal up to 43% off your entire order, plus free shipping and a free rechargeable frother when you use code Jesse. That's right, up to 43% off with code Jesse at MUDWTR.com. After your purchase, they'll ask you how you found them. Please show your support and let them know we sent you. Keep your energy natural and refreshing all year long with Mudwater, because life's too short for anything less than clean, delicious energy.
So there were people who had basically individuals from within those programs come to them and try to recruit them into programs where they weren't just remote viewing, they were using psychokinesis against targets of the U.S. intelligence community. And some people refused to get involved in that program. I think other people were successfully recruited into it, like Pat Price. And I think the reason Pat Price wound up dead is that he was recruited into that program and tasked with certain operations, and he wound up having serious moral reservations to that.
Yeah, it's interesting, too, because so Stargate was this, a program originally out of Stanford Research Institute that you're talking about, which, was the American Psychic Spy Program. It turned into, had a few other names and a few other agencies oversaw it before it was sunsetted in 1995. But I think a lot of people don't know that actually a lot of original people who were on that program came from Sidney Gottlieb's technical staff services. And so that guy, Sidney Gottlieb's, quote unquote, poisoner in chief, is sort of, the American Joseph Mengele, if you will. He was doing everything to confer a tactical advantage on behalf of the U.S. on pretty much all vectors of spooky science, and would kind of, lie, cheat, and steal in order to do that. And I think he ended up dying with his wife at a leper colony, presumably maybe to, make amends for his horrible deeds during his life or something. But, that connection, I think, is not super well known, that maybe it wasn't just this, maybe there were deeper black elements to this, program.
For sure. And so what Kant means when he uses the phrase storming heaven is precisely this, that we could wind up in a situation where, due to mainstream scientific recognition of these latent human abilities, which, by the way, we share with animals, there's extensive evidence of that animals have much stronger side than most people do, and that probably, on an evolutionary scale, there's an inverse relationship between the hypertrophy of technical intellect and the atrophy of these intuitive instinctual abilities. So, these latent human abilities that we share with animals could be retrieved and trained and cultivated in a very deliberate way. And, if these phenomena get mainstream scientific recognition, it's likely to be the case that many people will go adopt those training protocols the way that people train in martial arts today.
The way they would have to be trained up now. So, okay, this is a really wild conversation, because assuming psi is real, so this idea that the mind-matter thing is not this, total divide, there's a connection between mental phenomena and the physical world, that changes everything. All of a sudden, the pyramid where the bottom is physics, then you go chemistry, biology, psychology or whatever, and then consciousness, that gets flipped and consciousness goes at the bottom. And it's fundamental to sort of everything else. And so you'd have to assume, if that is the case, there are people walking among us that know that, probably even outside of the context of these kind of academic institutions studying this stuff. And there are probably covert training programs going on right now where maybe people involved in the training only have need to know or something. They're being trained and they don't even know they're being trained.
For sure. And, you can control a small cadre of such people. And if they get out of hand, there are ways of dealing with that. But if it becomes a large-scale social phenomenon where people are going and training their clairvoyance, their telepathic ability, their telekinetic ability, the way that people train martial arts these days, we are going to wind up in a situation like the Salem witch hunts, where you're going to have, how does a legal system even begin to deal with lawsuits that so-and-so hexed me and so-and-so burned my house down using telekinesis? It will be a nightmare.
It's an institutional apocalypse.
Absolutely. And so this is also one dimension of what we might call catastrophic disclosure, because based on, any serious empirical study of the UFO phenomenon, it's obvious that the entities who are engaging people from out of these craft are all adept telepaths, and they have already cultivated the psychic abilities that are latent in us and that we could also train. And so a disclosure of what's on the other side of the UFO phenomenon is also de facto a mainstream scientific recognition of psi. You're already starting to see this with people like Jake Barber coming from out of Lockheed, that, they're using basically telepathy and clairvoyance to summon these craft, right? And then, there's a lot of suggestion that the guidance system of these crafts involve a psychokinetic interaction between the pilots and the airframe and the propulsion system. So that you have some of these wild stories about, how very young people are being basically, selected and gathered together from various parts of the world and brought to these black facilities so that they can more effectively pilot these craft, right?
Yeah.
We also know that that there are operations OCONUS outside the continental United States where prospecting for psionic assets takes place, and they're highly coveted. And the interesting thing is I hear in those programs that there's something valuable about the life experience in third world countries, in that it seems as though people that live a simpler life and are outdoors more and have less contaminants in their food and their drugs and in their culture seem to be a little bit better at disassociating and heightening their intuition. And they come willingly because of the economic imbalance between where they come from.
So point being, you're not going to have UFO disclosure without also having what I call the spectral revolution, or a scientific revolution that recognizes the reality of psi abilities. And I can unpack what I mean by that spectral revolution if you'd like to go there, and why I think it's not just another revolution in the history of science like the Copernican revolution or the Darwinian revolution.
Yeah, I'd love to get into it. My personal belief is that it can't be just another scientific revolution, because science requires a priori skepticism, a la, Francis Bacon. And so you can't go into an experiment saying, I expect the null hypothesis if you want a result in the psi framework, right? So like if James Randi or, modern day Michael Shermer, like some of these scientific skeptics show up to one of these sort of, psychic experiments, and they have kind of a,
it has an inhibitory effect.
It does literally will have a restraining effect on the actual results that you might get. And so you get into this sort of air pockets of consensus reality thing where you have believers and non-believers, and they just don't sort of touch. And you can't really use the scientific method because, So,
by the way, that negative psi effect can also be empirically assessed, though. Because, people can be given like Zener card tests and so on and so forth. And if they're extreme skeptics, they'll do worse than they could by chance. So you see like the psychological resistance manifesting itself. It's sort of a negative form of psi, right? In any case, that's a very good point. So that's one of the ways in which, the conception of science that goes back to, say, Francis Biss or Francis Bacon and the Royal Society would have to be fundamentally changed. But, there's another huge one, and that's what Thomas Kuhn began to comment on when he wrote The Structure of Scientific Revolutions in the early 60s. And that's the paradigmatic nature of science. So what Kuhn pointed out is that scientific theories are nested within larger frameworks of interpretation. And these frameworks of interpretation establish as axiomatic and unquestioned. They assume certain hinge propositions. That's a term that comes from Ludwig Wittgenstein originally. Hinge propositions, meaning every other statement that's made hinges on certain unquestioned propositions. And every scientific paradigm has that superstructure. And scientists, as contrasted with philosophers, scientists never question those framework assumptions. So Kuhn noted that the basic assumptions of any scientific theory, which form the paradigm, that's the context for that theory, they have certain basic definitions of, let's say, mass and gravity and so on and so forth. And these are different definitions depending on the paradigm that you're working in. So mass and inertia don't mean the same thing in Newtonian physics as they do in Einsteinian physics. And this simplistic, elementary educational textbook notion that somehow Newtonian physics is understandable as a subset of like Einsteinian physics is not the case. They're not mutually translatable in that way. And what's more interesting about Kuhn's argument in the structure of scientific revolutions is that he says that if you carefully observe the conditions of a paradigm shift, let's say from the Copernican paradigm to, let's say, more sophisticated Newtonian physics to then Einsteinian relativity, the shifts always involve political conflict. And it's not the case that the promulgators of a previous paradigm are rationally convinced to adopt the new one. It's that they basically get old and die out, and there's a coup that takes place inside the scientific establishment. So he noted that scientific revolutions are also political revolutions in a sense. And here's the thing about a scientific revolution based on the recognition of psi, is that because the framing of paradigms is a psychological phenomenon, people who think that recognition of ESP and PK requires simply a new paradigm with metaphysical concepts that are more rigorously expressed in certain scientific equations and formulas are missing the forest for the trees. The revolution that recognizes psi is a revolution that gives us insight into the psychological mechanisms that frame paradigms in the first place. So understanding that consciousness, really actually sentience on a subconscious level, is forming physical phenomena as they emerge from out of the quantum domain. Understanding that intrinsic co-constitution of physical reality by consciousness is also to have insight into the psychological mechanism that frames paradigms to begin with. So then you can start to recognize, as Martin Heidegger did, that scientific theories are toolkits. They are not there to polish a mirror that provides us with an objective representation of some reality that's out there, as if our mind is a mirror, right? And it's representing an objectively existent reality. No. Scientific paradigms and the theories that any given paradigm makes possible are models. It's a technological enterprise. So the epistemic discoveries in science are derivative of, they're an outgrowth of, an essentially technological enterprise. In other words, a model building endeavor that involves tools that allow us to achieve different ends, okay? So if you think, for example, and there's a lot of discourse about this today, that, maybe we took a wrong turn with Einstein, and maybe, the dynamic ether model that Nikola Tesla was proposing and that perhaps Townsend Brown was working with was the more accurate model of the cosmos, and somehow Einstein went wrong. No. What we're in need of is a much more radical insight than that, which is that if you, let's say, want to travel at near the speed of light in a spacecraft, the right model for that is Einstein. If you want to create a quantum signaling system for like instantaneous communication across vast interstellar distances, the right model for that is quantum mechanics. That doesn't mean that you're ever going to have a meta theory that reconciles quantum theory and relativity. If you want to develop a electrogravitic craft, with a certain kind of, let's say, ability to tap 0-point energy as the basis for propulsion, you're going to need to work with the dynamic ether paradigm that Tesla was starting to develop. These are different toolkits. They're different models for achieving different ends. And we have to give up this idea that science is about developing an objective representation of the world as such, as if that reality, capital R, is separate from our own consciousness.
So this brings up a question. If tool making for specific ends and politics is driving science, which is supposed to be immune from politics, much more than we realize, then who is actually in the driver's seat when it comes to these sort of scientific paradigm shifts? Is there somebody behind Descartes, Kant, any of these sort of myth-making or world-making figures, Newton, where like the last 400 years is kind of, we look at reality based on, sort of vector calculus because of Newton, Leibniz,
Yes.
So who is pumping these ideas through these architects?
The religious control system on the planet.
And so what is that?
You know how we're always diving into the edge of science and consciousness on this show? Lately, I've been thinking a lot about aging, not just in terms of years, but in how it actually feels in the body. Slow recovery, lower energy, that middle-aged fog that sneaks up on you. I feel like I can barely go out and drink alcohol anymore. That's why I started using something called Qualia Senolytic, and it's been a major shift for me. Let me explain. As we age, our bodies accumulate what scientists call senescent cells, also known as zombie cells. These are worn-out cells that stop dividing but don't die. They hang around in your body, draining your energy, clogging up your recovery, and generally making you feel older than you are. Qualia Senolytic is a first-of-its-kind supplement formulated with 9 plant-based compounds designed to help your body naturally eliminate these zombie cells. It's not something you take every day, just 2 days a month, but it supports your body in aging better at the cellular level. Since I've started taking it, I've felt sharper, lighter, and like my body's resilience has come back online. It's vegan, non-GMO, and grounded in serious research. Experience the science of feeling younger. Go to qualialife.com/Jesse for up to 50% off your purchase and use code Jesse. Again, that's JESSE for an additional 15% off. That's QUALIALIFE.com/Jesse, JESSE, for an extra 15% off your purchase. Thanks so much to Qualia for sponsoring this episode.
So now this is to come back around to your first question, which I said, let's not scare the bejesus out of the listeners right off the bat, right?
Yeah.
The thing is, if you spend, any serious time looking into the UFO phenomenon, and by the way, it's something I've studied for 25 years or something like that. I touched on it toward the end of Prometheus and Atlas, which was published in 2016. It was my dissertation in 2012 and then was adapted into a book 2016. And then I wrote Closer Encounters, my study of the UFO phenomenon. Closer Encounters was published in 2021. But it's the outcome of like 20 years of preceding research. So anyone who goes into the UFO phenomenon, with even, half of that depth and endurance of research, inevitably realizes that whether you want to work through what Jacques Vallee's uncovered, or whether you want to at least look at Zecharia Sitchin's research, the UFO phenomenon extends through all of recorded human history and most likely into prehistory, and it's absolutely inseparable from both revealed religious systems like Judeo-Christianity and Islam, and also more archaic, how could we put it? Let's just say archaic polytheistic ritualistic religions like the religion of ancient Egypt or, the Vedic religion and so on and so forth. It's very clear that, in the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, the Devas and the Asuras, or what in the Greek language we might call the gods and the Titans, are exactly the same beings as, the Elohim, the Elohim in the Bible, or the rebel angels, the Nephilim in the biblical context. They're the same beings as the Anunnaki in Sumerian scriptures, where again you have two factions. This idea that there are two factions runs through every human religious belief system on the planet throughout the course of history.
Would you say Prometheus is an archetype of this
Absolutely.
rebel angel?
Absolutely. So, there's a through line from Enki in the Sumerian myths to Prometheus in the Greek context, to Quetzalcoatl in the Mayan context, to, let's say, a leader of the Asuras in a Hindu context.
Sort of demigod figure that transgresses on behalf of man against the gods.
Exactly.
Brings forth some sort of sacred technology to them.
Exactly. And in a Judeo-Christian context, of course, this is Lucifer.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So, you have the story in the Bible about how the serpent offered knowledge to humanity in Eden. And the reason the humans were kicked out of the garden, where, by the way, they were workers, because, the nakedness in antiquity was a sign of slave labor. And we were tillers of the field in Eden for the gods, except we didn't know it. We didn't know we were naked, meaning we didn't know we were slaves. And this God is threatened by our being given the discernment to recognize good versus evil, because that would mean we'd realize that our overlord is a bastard who wants to deny us knowledge. And what Adonai Elohim, the chief of the gods, says when he casts man out of Eden, or right before he does, is let us, basically exile them from the garden before they also eat of the tree of life and become like unto us, so that nothing becomes impossible to them, right? So this is a God who's jealous and afraid of humans achieving parity with the gods, with the Elohim. And there's this rebel who's symbolized by the serpent. Now, remember, the serpent is punished by having his legs removed. And then in the book of Revelation, Satan is referred to as the dragon, the great dragon, that serpent of old. In other words, Lucifer is explicitly identified with the serpent in Eden. Now, there's all kinds of people who want to argue against this because they want to save the Christian narrative in a Gnostic sense. And there are people who try to identify Jesus himself with Lucifer and so on and so forth. I used to teach comparative religion for a few years. And so there are all these nuances, but I think the evidence is there to make the case that the dragon from the book of Revelation is the serpent in Eden. And that's exactly the same figure as Quetzalcoatl, who's also represented as a feathered serpent, as a dragon, essentially. And that's the faction of Enki. And you see the symbol in Egypt, too, of, the serpents with wings coming out the sides of them, with the sun at the center, the symbol of the Shamasu Hor, the followers of Horus. So you have this through every human culture. And the narrative is essentially this, that we were created as workers or slaves or servants of some kind of celestial overlord, and we were put into a caste system, a hierarchy. The word hierarchy literally means holy order, hierarchy, a hierarchical pyramidal society of the kind you saw in ancient Egypt, of the kind that you see in the Varna system, the caste system of India, of the Hindu religion to this day. And at some point, there was a rebellion against this structure. I would say the most compelling version of the narrative of that rebellion is the one you find in Plato. Plato's story about Atlantis. But people get hung up on the name Atlantis. If there was such a civilization, probably, its denizens didn't refer to it as Atlantis. Plato uses that term because it signifies something very powerful. Atlantis means the realm of Atlas. And as I point out in my book, Prometheus and Atlas, Atlas is a very powerful metaphor. The idea of Atlas, of someone who has mapped the entire world and bears the earth on his shoulders, right? And actually, the globe that Atlas is bearing on his shoulders is not a terrestrial map, it's a star globe, which is what mariners use to navigate the world, right? And so it's this idea of basically developing a knowledge of the heavens and a mastery over the whole earth, and modeling the earth so that we wind up with, let's say, medical atlases. The atlas is a term for a model, right? So this is integral to the model building enterprise of technological science. So the idea of Atlantis archetypally is the idea of a demigod society, which, as Plato says, wanted to empower humans and was hybridizing itself with the lot of humanity, right? And thereby lifting up humanity, not just psychically and intellectually, but also genetically lifting up humanity. It's the idea of using technological science to unlock the secrets of the heavens and achieve parity with the gods, so that you no longer need to be a servile worshiper of some kind of overlord. And this is what Plato tells us was the great sin of the Atlanteans, is that they stopped sacrificing to the gods and worshiping them, so that Zeus basically calls a convocation of the Olympians and decides to wipe the world clean in what we more commonly know as Noah's flood, right? And so the biblical story of Noah is exactly the same thing, especially when you look at, in Genesis 6, right? There's a whole part of that story that's clearly been excised. So in Genesis 6, all of a sudden we're told, in rapid succession, oh, well, there was great iniquity on the earth, and God decided to wipe the entire earth clean in the flood. Wait a minute here. And the sons of the Elohim came down, and they found the daughters of man fair, and they, interbred with them, and so on and so forth, and the earth was full of iniquity. Seriously, in 2 paragraphs, you're going to tell us that God regretted the entire creation and wiped the whole world clean, right? There's a backstory here. And you find the backstory preserved in the Book of Enoch, which was first discovered in Ethiopia. And it clearly was at one point part of the Tanakh and was excised, due to whatever, theological power game that whoever was playing.
You feel confident that it was part of the original?
For sure, because the story makes no sense without it.
Mm.
And what you see in the Book of Enoch is a direct Hebraic parallel to what you see in Plato's account of Atlantis. And then, other cultures have their own versions of that. The Mayans do too.
In Enoch, it's the Watchers or whatever. And so, okay, how does all of this connect to the UFO story? Because you hear, I don't know, like, for example, Diana Pasulka came on my podcast and she said, Jacques Vallee is very interested in the devil and demons and fallen angels.
I'm having lunch with Jacques Vallee. So we're in his study, and it's really amazingly beautiful here in the Bay Area. And he starts to explain a couple of things to me, and I notice a bunch of books on shelves, and I notice those things, right?
Yeah.
So I go and I start to look to see what he has on this one shelf. And then he takes one of the books off, and it was a book about angels. And he says, of course, you can't have one without the other, right? Because he picked up another book and he said, you need to read this book. And whenever he says that to me, of course, I'm going to get the book and read it. But this one was weird. So he showed it to me, and it was The History of Satan. It just had these big words on it that says Satan. And again, if I wasn't a little bit concerned before, I was absolutely concerned at that point. I was like, Jacques Vallee is handing me this book that says Satan on it. And so he said, look at the pagination. So I, looked at the pagination. It was 666.
Whoa.
Yeah. I thought that was so, of course.
Wild.
It was a really weird moment. And he said that in the States, we think of Satan or the devil as really, really terrible, right? But, he said that the French, they have a different view of it. And it's less sensationalist. That's what he was saying.
So what does all of this have to do with the modern kind of UFO topic?
Well, I knew Jacques Vallee for a while. And
I spoke to him this morning, actually.
Yeah. So after, I think it was 7, within 9 months of the time Prometheus and Atlas came out, he had invited me to his home. And we had a nice dinner and fairly intimate conversation, and I brought this question up with him, and because we were discussing basically, and we'll come around to this, time travel, and whether he believed that these were basically humans that were reaching back into our epoch from the future, and that essentially, there was a breakaway civilization that had developed a hyperdimensional relationship to the various space-times of the epochs of human history. That a breakaway civilization with time travel essentially was able to have a fifth-dimensional relationship with the various 4D space-times of different human historical epochs, right? And I basically said to him, well,
some sort of multiverse management system.
Yes, and I think that's
a branch management system.
And I think that's definitely part of what's going on, right? So how I start my book, Closer Encounters, is I lay out all the different hypotheses. Of course, the ETH, the extraterrestrial hypothesis, and then, time travel, interdimensional hypothesis, the psychic projections hypothesis, crypto-terrestrial, meaning survivors of Atlantis, which we're touching on here, and ultimately also avatars of a simulacrum. Are we living in a simulacrum? Are these in some sense avatars from the programming level of the simulacrum, which is something that Vallee, as a computer scientist, also has intimated in various writings of his. So, but the point is this, that, we were discussing this, hyperdimensional, extratemporal relationship that these entities have to humans in various historical epochs. And I said to him, well, if this is what you think, why aren't you more direct about expressing that? And he said, because it involves deeply entrenched religious sensibilities of various societies. And there's a sociological dimension to this that could be catastrophic in terms of religious belief systems.
We're skipping over one part, which is, what does he think? What is the relationship between, the devil, demonic, and UFOs and all this stuff?
I didn't pin him down on that, so I don't want to speak for him, but I suspect that what a lot of people are concerned about, including people in the deep state of our own government, first and foremost, is that the bad guys won. In the struggle over reshaping human history, we wound up losing a rebellion against a control system that abides to this day. And the meta-narratives that have dominated the rise and fall of various societies throughout the course of history, including, for example, the destruction of the secular humanistic culture of the late Roman Empire, the Library of Alexandria, libraries at Corinth, the entire, that I'm getting this figure from Carl Sagan. We lost 98% of the knowledge of classical antiquity. They have actually done studies based on the references that we do have to other texts by various authors in the classical manuscripts that have survived, and they've been able to do a reconstruction that shows that we lost at least 98% of the knowledge of classical antiquity. Well, who does that benefit?
Let's talk about a guilt-free alternative to alcohol that's perfect for your dry January or any time you want to unwind. Cornbread's organic CBD gummies. These gummies are an absolute lifesaver for my evening routine. They're a natural way to relax, celebrate, or wind down without the hangover. I've cut back a lot on my alcohol consumption over the last few years. For a lot of you trying out dry January or cutting back generally, it's not always easy, but swapping that glass of wine for Cornbread's CBD gummies is a total game changer. It's a simple upgrade to your evening routine that leaves you feeling great the next day without sacrificing the fun. Plus, with all natural ingredients, they're the perfect way to stay balanced. Cornbread hemp isn't just a product, it's a small way to bring balance into your life. Whether you're journaling, meditating, or simply enjoying some downtime, these gummies elevate the experience without any of the guilt. It's like having a moment of calm in your pocket, ready whenever you need it. Alcohol doesn't have to be the default anymore. Whether you're cutting back for dry January or just looking for a healthier way to relax, you've got to try Cornbread CBD gummies. Right now, American Alchemy listeners can save 30% on their first order. Just head to cornbreadhemp.com/Jesse and use code Jesse at checkout. Again, that's cornbreadhemp.com/Jesse, code Jesse. Cornbread Hemp. This is the good life.
Who benefits through all these resets of human societies? Another horrendous one.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Islamic conquest of Iran. At least as bad as the Judeo-Christian takeover of the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
So...
And you have all this kind of forbidden archaeology where you see precocious advancements in past civilizations that shouldn't really exist, whether it's a Sumerian model of the heliocentric universe or the Antikythera mechanism, which is this, kind of ancient, almost astronomically aligned computer system that is found on this, shipwreck in the Aegean Sea. You have a bunch of examples of this.
Yes. So on the one hand, you have what look like gifts. Gifts from Prometheus, to speak archetypally. And on the other hand, you have attempts to decimate human knowledge and engineer regression and retardation to basically, reverse human progress. And one of the most interesting
So
episodes.
who would that benefit? The sort of
whoever's running the control system,
Malthusian, feast and famine sort of cyclical, cataclysm thing. That would benefit whoever's running the control.
Well, exactly.
Do you have a model of who that is, or?
Yeah, I do.
Who is it?
I do. So, okay, the devil's in the details, or maybe we should invert the religious symbolism there, right? But let me just point to one interesting example of this. Right before the Renaissance took place, I mean, Renaissance is obviously an example of a rebirth of the will to know and human cultivation, both artistically and scientifically. Right? I mean, Prometheus didn't just bring science to humanity. Prometheus brought techne, both in the sense of the arts and the sciences. And so the Renaissance is a quintessentially Promethean phenomenon. It's interesting that immediately before the Renaissance, you had these huge UFO battles over various European cities. And they're reflected in the broadsheets of the time, the newspapers of the time. In Basel, Switzerland, in Nuremberg, in Germany, they show these huge battles between objects in the sky.
Really?
And some of them, I mean, you can, Vallee's reprinted them in Wonders in the Sky. There are a number of texts on the UFO phenomenon. These are newspapers that show huge triangular craft, spheres of various colors, attacking each other, some of them falling from out of the sky in battles that took place in several places over Central Europe.
This is like 15th century? Or?
Just before the Renaissance, 1400s.
1400,
yeah. So just before So to me, that looks like the rebel faction gaining ground and opening up a space for humanity to progress again for a while, right? Now, there was also...
Whoa, that's interesting. So you think that like these celestial battles take place right before there's some airdropping of human technology or something?
Look, I don't want to reduce human agency, by calling it an airdropping, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was a little help, right? But at the very least...
Vallee would say donations.
Yeah, and at the very least, there was a safeguarding of a space for human development and, the rebirth of ingenuity and so forth. But then, as I was mentioning earlier, let's say the Jesuit order tried to capture that and control it again through, a frontman like Descartes, where you had somebody like Giordano Bruno developing a very holistic sort of, how can I put it, hermetic, alchemical matrix for what could have been a very different form of modern science. And that was destroyed through the reductive, dualistic model of Descartes, right? Where everything in the physical world can only be understood in terms of mechanistic causality, and then whatever spiritual can't be discussed rationally, and therefore, the church continues to have a monopoly over that discourse. So there were attempts to then basically suffocate the Renaissance and warp the energies of the Renaissance to have it miscarry into what became materialistic, reductionistic modern science.
Yeah, you have this great book, I think Frances Yates, The Rosicrucian Enlightenment. She talks about King Frederick sort of housing a lot of these heretical thinkers, John Dee, Edward Kelly, and I think Giordano Bruno.
That's right.
Well, and then there's this war, and I think Descartes fights on the other side of the war, right?
Exactly.
Which is really interesting. And so, it's almost symbolic that you have this kind of fighter in the world of reason actually engaging in this battle against the literal people housing or providing safe haven to some of these more heretical thinkers who are claiming to commune directly with angels and that sort of thing.
That's right. And, the Renaissance was supposed to take place in the 1300s. If you look at...
Wait, what does that mean?
Well...
They missed their programming schedule?
If you look at, the trajectory of cultural development in the so-called Middle Ages, right? You start to see the development of academies and the rudiments of empirical investigations into nature in the late 1200s. And, people like Paracelsus and Cornelius Agrippa and the great alchemists come from out of this cultural development. This is where the Faust story comes from, right? The legend of Dr. Faustus. It's that period in the late 1200s, early 1300s. And then what happened? The Black Plague. When you look at accounts of what actually went on during the Black Plague, and here, the work of William Bramley is absolutely indispensable. He wrote this book, The Gods of Eden. And as far as I can tell, Bramley he wrote this masterful text, and then he never went back to the UFO phenomena. So he's the furthest thing from a grifter, who just wanted to write one book after another about this stuff, right? Yeah. No, he settled it, and that was it. He had he said what he had to say. So Bramley started out as a very conventional researcher trying to understand war profiteering. He wanted to understand, who was behind engineering all these wars throughout history, and whether there was some systematic way in which profiteering was taking place through large-scale engineered human suffering. And he was thinking, bankers and banking elites and shit like that, right?
Yeah.
And he finds UFOs.
How does he connect that? That's fascinating.
So he goes in detail through archival material that's left from various historical epochs, including in this case the Middle Ages. And he notices that at the time the Black Plague breaks out, there are many UFO sightings. There are sightings of objects that land in fields. It was so prominent that hysteria broke out about it in the French court, and Charlemagne was considering declaring war on the tyrants of the air.
During the reign of Charlemagne, there were many accounts of encounters with tyrants of the air and their aerial ships. These accounts so concerned Charlemagne that those reporting such strange phenomena were subject to torture and death. Here is one recorded event given between the 8th and 9th century in France.
One day, among other instances, it chanced at Lyon that 3 men and a woman were seen descending from these aerial ships. The entire city gathered about them, saying that they were magicians sent by Charlemagne's enemy to destroy the French harvest. In vain, the 4 innocents sought to vindicate themselves, saying that they were their own country folk and had been carried away a short time since by miraculous men who had shown them unheard of marvels. Luckily, the Bishop of Lyon pronounced the incident as false, saying it was not true these men had fallen from the sky, and what the townsfolk said they had seen there was impossible. The people believed what their good bishop said rather than their own eyes, and set at liberty the 4 ambassadors from the ship.
And this is where the whole Magonia thing that Vallee talks about, this is that period where, you had these people supposedly coming from Magonia, and some of them were arrested. And then this Bishop Agabard, who was like a proto-rationalist, came up with a justification for why this couldn't possibly be real. So these guys got let go and they went back to their airships or whatever the hell. But here's the really creepy part about this research that Bramley did, is that he found that the plague broke out only after these people would land in the fields, come out of these objects, land in the field, and they would go around with these hoods on and these spray cans that became the basis for the scythe and the Grim Reaper image. They were shrouded, and they had these things, from out of which stuff would spray, and it became the image of the scythe and the iconography of the Grim Reaper. And not only were they spraying the fields, they would sometimes walk through towns, and people would be terrified and go into their homes, and these guys would walk and deliver door-to-door service, spraying the doors of individual homes, where then the plague would break out shortly thereafter, So it was biological warfare. And you know what the result of that was? A mass retreat back into religious fundamentalism. We were about to have the Renaissance in the late 1200s, early 1300s, and then all of a sudden, this Black Plague comes. People are terrified. It decimates the population of Europe. So it also reduces the industrial work base for a scientific industrial revolution. And worst of all, it causes people to retreat back into a regressive religious belief system.
So what's Bramley's conclusion as to what the connection is between UFOs and war profiteering?
He thinks that basically these, plague promulgators are representing the same faction that was lording over humanity in the Sumerian epoch through, the name of Enki or whatever, the Anunnakis aligned with Enki, or the Elohim in the, Old Testament or the devas, to put it in Hindu terms. Richard Thompson, he's the guy who co-authored Forbidden Archaeology with Michael Cremo. Richard Thompson has written a great UFO book, like looking very carefully at Hindu scriptures such as the Ramayana and Mahabharata. I think it's called Alien Identities. Now, granted, he's coming from out of a Hare Krishna tradition, and so he has his own religious commitments and so forth, but you can filter that out and just look at the empirical analysis. And it's very clear from Thompson's analysis in that book that, the devas, who are worshipped by, I don't know, a billion Hindus or something, are these entities. So, we're in a very unfortunate position, right? If, in fact, we're inside of a control system governed by people who want us to remain subordinates and are doing everything that they can so that we don't achieve parity with them. Now, obviously, this has tremendous implications in terms of any so-called disclosure. Because UFO disclosure, in the context of the, modern, industrial or whatever you want to say, post-industrial, economy that we have today, would mean our rapidly achieving technological parity with these people. And by the way, we'll come back to this, but this whole NHI discourse really bothers me.
Well, who are these
right?
people?
Yeah, exactly. Who are these people?
So the NHI is like a psyop against
Right.
the idea of that there's actually just a strata of people.
I think this is what's so deeply disturbing to most researchers, and it's the deepest secret that's being covered up by various governments in the world. It's easier for the average, person to imagine even a hostile threat emerging from deep space that has nothing like a human face, because you can, compartmentalize it. It's like, the War of the Worlds or whatever, right? But the idea that what's really going on here is that there's a Hegelian master-slave dialectic at work in human history, and that the masters in that dialectic have so raised themselves above the common lot of humanity that they appear as angels or celestial beings or whatever, and that they've used that mask in order to keep us inside regressive belief systems and to render us useful to them. So, okay, we have to look at the details of various cases if we want to get at who these people are, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how their society came about and how this power structure was developed in the first place.
Are these humans with psi abilities, or are they beings from elsewhere, or what? Who are they?
So let's briefly, again, you've done like a plethora of interviews going into specific cases, so we don't want to get too bogged down, in the nitty-gritty of cases here, but it's important to refer to a few empirical cases here. So Ingo Swann,
Mm-hmm.
in the 1970s into the 1980s, did remote viewings of both the moon and of Mars.
Mm-hmm.
In the 1970s, he was taken from out of the SRI program that eventually became Stargate and Grill Flame and whatever. He was taken from out of that into some other black unit, which, he never learned what the name of it was. Some guy who identified himself as Axelrod took him like blindfolded by helicopter into some facility. And he was asked to remote view this target, of course, which he was blind to. It turned out that the target was the moon. And now, bear in mind just, that at this point we had detailed satellite reconnaissance photography of the moon. An important case in this regard is the testimony of Carl Wolf. Carl Wolf he was a photographic repair expert, and at that time sergeant in the early 1960s leading up to the Apollo missions. And at one point he was brought to what he thought was an NSA facility, because he thought was a NASA facility, because he'd never heard of the NSA. A lot of Americans hadn't. It turned out it was an NSA facility that was processing lunar orbiter reconnaissance photos. And Carl Wolf, long story short, he says he, in the course of repairing this machine, was shown mosaic photographs of a huge megalithic city on the dark side of the moon. That there was a city with largely polygonal architecture, Titanic scale structures, but they weren't made of metal and glass. They were made of something that, to him looked like poured stone, like concrete or something. And in fact, they reminded him of, megalithic architecture on the earth. Now, back to Ingo Swann. So point being, if Carl Wolf saw mosaic photographs in the 1960s, Swann in the 70s is being tasked to remote view the moon by people who have access to these photographs. So I'm thinking
And
they
Carl
want
Wolf
him...
died a mysterious death after he...
Exactly. So by the way, Carl Wolf, and this is horrible. These, so, I mean, what are we discussing? Disclosure and how disclosure could be manipulated. Well, just before this wave of so-called disclosure began, in 2017, 2018, poor Carl Wolf was run over just the way John Mack was run over, And I hardly think it's a coincidence because he would definitely have been one of the people subpoenaed to testify.
Mm-hmm.
And what Carl Wolf had to say is something that, whoever's gatekeeping this whole disclosure business does not want out there in the public. In any case, Ingo Swann in the 1970s, when he was remote viewing what was on the moon, was dealing with people who had access to these photographs. And I think what they wanted was for him to snoop around on the ground, as it were, get a ground's eye view of this city on the dark side of the moon. And here's what he saw there. He saw tall Nordic people, statuesque Nordic people, who gave him a look like, you don't belong here, get the fuck out of here and don't come back. And he saw these same people lording over basically armies of slave laborers who he said were naked, meaning that they're probably under some kind of a dome that we can't see, transparent dome or something. And they were living in these like ramshackle, like makeshift shelters under appalling conditions, conducting slave labor on the moon. Swann also remote viewed Mars in the early 80s. And he said these same people who he had seen on the moon were responsible for a civilization, the ruins of which he viewed on Mars. There were very large, like honeycombed cities, which he said showed evidence of explosions, internal explosions. Like, he said he had the impression that a battle had taken place there.
Well, it's funny you say that. There's a PhD physics who's, I think he worked at Sandia or Los Alamos and also Lawrence Livermore. His name is John Brandenburg. And he says that xenon-129 and argon-40 exist in excess of what you would ever expect just from natural radioactive isotope decay. And that proves that there was actually some nuclear holocaust on Mars.
Well, they found a large amount of xenon-129, which is the product of two things. Supernova explosions and hydrogen bomb explosions. And we know there was no supernova on Mars. If there was, there wouldn't be a solar system here.
And you said there was one other argon?
There was when you irradiate rocks that have potassium in them, and all rocks do, they produce a isotope called argon-40, and that's super abundant on Mars. So you have two things that are products of what look like an intense nuclear reaction on Mars in the atmosphere.
Yeah, I spent several days with Dr. Brandenburg in New Mexico, and I put this in Closer Encounters, this research of Dr. Brandenburg, that basically the deviation from normal of the isotopic ratio of xenon-129 in Cydonia specifically, where we have photographic evidence of ruins on Mars, the xenon-129 isotopic signature at Cydonia, he has discovered, is only matched by thermonuclear test sites on the Earth. It's the only other place in the solar system where we see that kind of signature. And he came to that conclusion when he was working at Sandia Labs, which is where, nuclear weapons research takes place in the United States, okay? So there's evidence that some kind of a nuclear confrontation took place on Mars. And by the way...
And Carl Sagan called him and said, hey, John, why are you causing so much trouble?
Yeah.
I found that very interesting. Carl Sagan, who held definitely security clearances and knew more than...
I'm pretty convinced Sagan was a member of Majestic.
That would make sense to me, yeah. Because he sort of flipped to he was very interested in UFOs, we know, earnestly interested growing up, his mentor. He would have debates, you know.
The book he wrote was Shklovsky, the Soviet scientist. He co-wrote Intelligent Life in the Universe. And Sagan himself at that point was saying, you know, we should look at ancient myths and check the archaeological and historical record for contact and so on and so forth.
There you go.
And then all of a sudden...
And he had a security clearance, I think, project, was it A119, I think, in the late 50s, where they were considering nuking the moon as a show of force against the Soviets. And he had a security clearance through the Air Force through that. And then it was interesting. He sort of flipped into anti-UFO mode and like almost official priestly citadel spokesman of the American scientific community, right as J. Allen Hynek moved from, you know, rationalizing, explaining everything away via Project Blue Book, the official Air Force fake program, into more openness. Like it was like kind of late 60s, early 70s. It's kind of this interesting kind of, you know, thing.
And he was the right age by that point to be recruited into such an organization, you know. In any case, Brandenburg came to the conclusion that something like an Empire State building's worth of nuclear weapons had been detonated to produce that kind of a deviation of xenon-129 isotope at Cydonia. But so Swan saw evidence of this on the ground, okay, like a devastated civilization. And he said it was the same people who he saw on the moon as basically slave drivers. Now, unbeknownst to Swan, and by the way, when Swan remote viewed Mars, he worked with a team of, I believe, 5 other remote viewers, and they were all, you know, they did it independently, right? And they were all blind to the target. But unbeknownst to that whole team led by Ingo Swann, in 1984, I think it was the same year, in 1984, Joe McMoneagle at the Monroe Institute did a remote viewing of Mars for the CIA. And
really? I thought it was in the 90s.
No,
really?
1984.
1984.
Yeah, go look it up. The paper's available now. It's been declassified.
Wow.
You can read the whole report.
Yeah.
It's been declassified by the CIA.
Yeah.
And it's 1984. I believe the title is Mars 1 million BC.
Yeah.
And because initially they say to him, go to Mars like 1 million BC. That's what's in the envelope, right? But what he said to them was, when McMoneagle wound up there, he said, oh, it's all in ruins. It's there were people once here. I see like ghosts of people who once were, but they're not here anymore.
I saw people who were 12 to 14 feet tall.
So then they, yes. So they said to him, okay, well, if it's devastated and the people aren't around anymore, go back to when they were around.
Mm-hmm.
Now, he never reports on how far back that was. He just goes mentally to when they still had a civilization.
So they go back to 1 million and there's some recent ruins, and then he goes back further.
Exactly.
And he sees the people.
Exactly. Now,
okay.
These people are the same again as Swan saw. Very tall, sort of Nordic people, very broad-shouldered people, not an ounce of body fat. They're wearing these skin-tight clothes, that reveal every contour of every muscle. And he says some very interesting things about their worldview, their outlook, and their dying civilization. But what's most interesting is this. He says that a group of them were sent out in a craft to go scout out a new world that they could possibly develop as a habitation for themselves, because Mars was no longer a planet on which they could survive, right? And this scout ship runs into a planet where there are constant electrical storms. There's a tremendous amount of volcanic activity. It's the opposite of Mars, but in a way that's also difficult to support human life. In other words, it's overgrown with vegetation, right? It's an incredibly volatile but living planet. And they're like, we can't live in this planet under these conditions. We would have to modify this planet to live there. And so I suspect that what's going on there is the scouting out of a primordial Earth by people from Mars. Which then brings us to the question of the moon, and what the moon is, right? I mean, so we've got Carl Wolf telling us there's a city on the dark side of the moon. We've got Ingo Swann having done remote viewing that confirms that. But I think that the situation with the moon is actually a lot more disturbing than there simply being, a city-sized alien base on the backside of the base on the backside of the moon. You look at the geometry and the mathematics of the moon in relation to the Earth and the sun, it makes no sense. The moon is 1/400th the distance between the Earth and the sun, and it's 1/400th the size of the sun. And so that creates these perfect eclipses. that we see, right? That by itself is very odd. And then you look at the fact that the craters on the moon are all only a few miles deep. You never find a crater on the moon that's more than 5 or 6 miles deep. But some of these craters are like 186 miles wide, right? So, and at the, the base of the largest craters, you see a convex surface. In other words, it looks nothing like the Grand Canyon or the Valles Marineris on Mars, where an asteroid would hit it and you'd see a deep gouge that should be proportionally as deep as it is wide. No. What you're seeing, apparently, is a hard shell that's being revealed through the impact against the regolith by whatever object. The ejecta is going 186 miles out in every direction, but there's never a crater deeper than a few miles, and what's being revealed there at the crater base is a hard, convex surface. Then there's the impact. One of them was a test, one of them was accidental. The first one, I think part of an Apollo lander hit the moon, and there was a seismograph that had already been positioned there, and it registered basically the seismic signature that you would face if you were measuring a hollow object. That basically the reverberations went down for about 20 miles, and then they stop. And the way that the reverberation was distributed throughout the moon suggested that, as the observers, put it, it rang like a bell. And so then they repeated this test deliberately a second time. I think it was in Apollo 13. And this time they hit it with a more significant impact. And this kind of seismic signature was observed for 3 hours. The moon basically ringing like a hollow object for 3 hours. So there's all this evidence that the moon is an artificial satellite. And setting this in the context of Joe McMoneagle's remote viewing of Mars, what I argue in Closer Encounters is that the people on Mars probably constructed the moon for two purposes. One, as a very large-scale transport of a significant population from Mars to the orbit of the Earth. And two, as a terraforming device to radically alter the ecological situation of the planet so as to make it habitable for humans, right? They said there were these horrendous constant electrical storms and volcanic eruptions and so on and so forth. Well, the Earth spun a lot faster before if the moon had not been in orbit at some point, we would have been dealing with a planet that was a lot more unstable, spinning much faster, prone to toppling over. The moon acts as a tremendous stabilizer for the Earth. By the way, that's another thing about the moon, is that it has a unusually stable orbit as compared to the moons around other planets, as if there's a stabilizer inside of it. So I think it was created to transport a large population, and it was used as a terraforming device. Now, to answer your deeper question, what does that say about who these people are, right? Number one, it says that they're people. So NHI is not an appropriate appellation for these individuals, right? They look like us, particularly they look Nordic, and they appear to have been the progenitors of the human race. Not only that, they appear to have terraformed the Earth to make it habitable for humanoids. But I have one huge problem with all of that. The time scales. It makes no sense whatsoever to me that you would have people who look like us, I don't know, millions of years BC on Mars. The same people are basically, I don't know, involved in the power struggle that's been remembered as the myth of the Atlantean revolt. The same people are being encountered today by, let's say, Travis Walton. When Walton was abducted, first he had to deal with these grays, these little robotic entities that, tried to put him back together after he, sustained some kind of physical damage being thrown by the, electrogravitic repulsion of the craft. But then he, big strapping fellow that he was, he broke free of the control of these robots, and the medical facility or whatever went down the hallway, and he bumped into these Nordics. And from there on, he was handled by these people. He said they looked like they could all have been members of the same family.
I went into another room where there was a chair. There was some kind of a projection or some kind of a viewing thing in this room where you could see a map of the stars. A man came in while I was trying to find a way out there. And this was a human-looking person. They'd pass in a crowd, this individual, and on Earth. He was bigger than me, taller, and more muscular, a very large individual. I went up and tried to talk to this guy, and he didn't answer me. He led me outside of this craft that I was in, which was apparently parked inside of a large room or a building or a larger craft, and led me out of this room into another room where some other beings like himself put me unconscious. When I regained consciousness, I found myself laying on the roadway, and I saw a craft hovering there that just sat there for a second and just shot straight up. That's the last I've seen of.
And then you have cases like, Betty, Andreas, and Luca, where, again, you have her taken, she's frozen together with her family by Greys who come into the house. This is 1960s housewife. And her and her daughter, Becky, I believe, were both taken. And initially, they're handled by the Greys, who freeze the family and abduct them from the home. But then they are brought to a place where they encounter these angelic-looking Nordic beings who proceed to tell Betty that essentially they're the angels and that the little Greys are responsible for writing down all the deeds of humans. They're like a mass surveillance system that keeps a record of everybody's life. And these tall angelic beings told her that they brought Christ into the world, and don't worry, they're going to bring him back again soon. And while she was with them, and by the way, she didn't say they took her into space. They seemed to have taken her somewhere underground or underwater. And while she was there, she noticed this like doorway or large mirror or something that led toward this light. And some of these little gray entities went into the light, and they told her, you can't go in there. That's the one, that's the source. And that sent Jesus into the world and will again soon, right? So a couple of points I want to make through, these various cases. One is that we often hear these narratives where these, tall, statuesque, beautiful Nordics are pitted against these ugly little transhumanist gray robots. And, like the Eisenhower story that, Eisenhower met with the Nordics first, and then, he met with the Greys, and the Greys made him a better deal because the Nordics wanted us to get rid of our nuclear weapons. The Greys said, no, we'll give you our technology. Just let us abduct a certain number of people each year. This is extremely dubious to me, this narrative, because there are plenty of cases that attest to the fact that the Greys are some kind of a cybernetic robot that work for these Nordics. And the Nordics appear to be the ones in control. So if there's a narrative that's being promulgated of, beneficent Nordics versus like inhuman, monstrous Greys, I think it's some kind of good cop, bad cop, bait and switch that's being set up here to ultimately put us in a position of captivation. And you first see this in 1950s Italy. There's a case that I cover in Closer Encounters. This guy, Bruno Samaciccia, and his associates were engaged by these Nordics who had underground bases. And they claimed, first of all, as you see with all these cases of encounters with Nordics, demonstration of tremendous psi abilities. These Nordics are all telepathic. They can perform, impressive telekinetic feats and so on and so forth. But what this Bruno Samaciccia and his associates said is that these Nordics were so benevolent, like they would never harm a fly. But they told us that there were these other entities, the contrari, the CTR, the contrari, who are these little robotic entities, and they're soulless, and they just want to, they want control over the human soul because they don't have souls themselves, and they're locked in a millennial battle with these beings. And so this Nordics versus Grey narrative goes all the way back to the 1950s. Interestingly, Samaciccia makes a little note that, at one point it occurred to me that the SS were involved in eugenics programs, and there were rumors that after the war, these eugenics programs were continued in secret in underground facilities and so on and so forth. And I wonder whether these people that we saw, and they also saw very young people fitting this Nordic type, were basically products, outcomes of such programs that had begun in the Second World War. He engages, albeit briefly, in that kind of speculation. So, long story short, my point is that these people are integral to human history and to the development of human society. We're not dealing with something that's coming from the outside. And I'd be very suspicious of, claims by, let's say, George Adamski saying that so-and-so Furkan told him that he was from Mars, or George Van Tassel saying that he was dealing with Venusians, or Billy Meyer telling us about the, beneficent Pleiadians who are going to come to save us all, right? These beings are incredibly deceptive. I mean, deception is part of their MO. Jacques Vallee picks up on this in the context of the fairy folklore of the Middle Ages. I mean, one very consistent thing that you see in encounters with the gentry, the elite fairies in Brittany and in Ireland and so on and so forth, is that the peasants know that these beings lie all the time. They lie all the time about everything. And they only call them the good folk because otherwise they'll get pissed off and Lord knows what they'll do to you. So I think we're dealing with a faction of humanity that's positioned itself as a sort of overlord or master caste above the common herd. And they have adopted all kinds of guises and disguises to, strategically deceive us for the sake of the preservation of their control system.
How do you answer the time scale question? So you were saying, if you have millions of years ago, these, beings that looked like us existed on Mars, and then you have Greys acting as their sort of robotic little drone emissaries. How does that necessarily answer this question of
right.
Time scales?
So the biggest problem with UFO disclosure is that the 0-point energy electrogravitic propulsion system is not just going to give you a craft that travels from New York to Australia in an hour, right? It's going to give you a flying time machine. So you remember in the 1950s, I believe you've covered the subject before, and I go into it in some depth in Closer Encounters. There were these newspaper articles quoting the chairman of Martin Aircraft, Lear, Convair, saying that the G engines are coming, that we've cracked anti-gravity, and within a few years, at a cost comparable to the Manhattan Project, we can have industrial scale development of electrogravitic craft that will get you from New York to Australia in an hour. Here's the problem, though. What they didn't realize, and I think what was explained to them when they finally got the memo, is that these are flying time machines. They mess with the spatio-temporal fabric in a way that causes time dilation and time displacement. And I have this also on personal testimony, which I've told the story before, but I never revealed who told me this. In this case, I will.
Okay.
Because, man, the guy is old. And, if anyone, nobody at this point should be wanting to cause him any trouble in his life. Lynn Buchanan, in his living room, told me a story about how at one point he was taken to a Lockheed facility in California, deep underground facility. He said that it was like a shack on the side of the road. And you went into this shack and all of a sudden the floor of the place dropped. The whole thing was an elevator. And it took you down, I don't know how many hundreds of feet through solid rock. And he came out into this facility where they had reconstructed FAA style a collision between an airliner and a UFO. Like the way that FAA reconstructs airline collisions.
What do you mean reconstruct?
Like when there's been a plane crash, the FAA will lay out the pieces of the craft to emulate the moment of impact.
Whoa.
And with like little flags and stuff. And
so like a model of it?
No, they take the wreckage.
Pieces?
They take the wreckage and they reassemble it as best they can.
So he saw a shattered UFO.
Exactly. With a civilian, I don't know if it was civilian airliner. an aircraft, a human aircraft.
Okay.
But maybe it was a military one. I don't know. He didn't say.
Yeah.
Anyway, they had this reconstruction, and the reason they brought him there is that they were trying to figure out how this UFO works.
Mm-hmm.
And there was something about the guidance system that they couldn't figure out. And they wanted him to remote view how this thing was used by the pilots. Anyway, here's the important thing, is that when he was at this facility, he says that they conveyed to him that they were training pilots to fly UFOs. I don't know whether the recovered UFOs or reverse engineered UFOs based on their design, but they were training American pilots to fly these UFOs. And the biggest problem was time displacement. That these craft would, you couldn't travel through space with them without some degree of time displacement. And that was incredibly disorienting to the pilots. So they had developed models for how much time displacement there would be based on warping of space-time by the electrogravitic drive. And they were trying to teach this to these pilots so that their brains weren't scrambled by time travel, essentially. So I have that testimony also to confirm what I think is already a very sound theoretical speculation. And Michael Masters goes into this in his book on UFOs and time travel, which I cite in Closer Encounters, that the zero-point energy drive is going to give you a time machine, not just a propulsion platform. So why do people look like, I don't know, Nordic, Olympic swimmers millions of years BC on Mars? And, how is there such a continuity, not just of the looks of the people, of the architecture? What McMoneagle and Swan saw on Mars was a style of architecture that matches the most titanic megalithic structures on Earth. And that's also the style in which that city was built on the dark side of the moon, which, Carl Wolf saw the photographs of, which Ingo Swann wandered around, through astral projection. Why is there a consistent style of architecture over millions and millions of years? Because it's not a linear temporal continuity. We are dealing with people who achieved time travel at some point. That point could be the future. Looking at it from a linear perspective, it could be 2050, it could be, 3100. At some point, time travel is achieved by a group of humans. Those humans appear to be of Nordic phenotype and genotype. Those people then began to manipulate the variables of human history hyperdimensionally. So it's not like they were Martians that once had a civilization millions of years ago on Mars, and somehow, they've gone into cryo chamber, although they did report that there were cryo chambers on Mars, and that there were people who had been left there, and they'd been waiting to be woken up, and nobody came back for them. McMoneagle said that.
These pyramidal places are like hibernation chambers. They're trying to survive until somebody comes to save them.
In any case, but I don't think that comes anywhere close to explaining the temporal continuity here. I think what we're seeing is a group of people who have learned how to drop into different epochs of human history from out of what you might loosely call a fifth dimensional frame of reference.
Interesting. And so, people talk about, it's interesting you said Nordics versus Greys. I often hear Nordics versus reptilians. So, like, are the Nordics the only faction that have some sort of transtemporal ability to time hop? Or is there some other faction that also, has plans for the Earth?
Here's what I speculate about the reptilians in Closer Encounters, okay? If you take seriously the possibility that the moon is a terraforming device and that the biosphere of this planet was radically reshaped to make it habitable for humans. Well, that would have involved also the extinction of the dinosaurs, right? So the Nordics coming here from Mars were responsible for the extinction of the dinosaurs. Now, the Sumerian myths tell us that when the Anunnaki engineered a slave race on Earth, they went through several successive models, and the first few were failures. So they started by engineering other types of humanoid beings.
So is there Anunnaki in the Sumerian type? Like, because there's this debate of whether, Zechariah Sitchin was right about these things. So you think there are
they're for sure Anunnaki. The debates are about whether, like, for example, Sitchin says the word Shem means rocket.
Okay.
And, it means a pillar that, like, stands, it's like debates over, to what extent are these metaphors or are these, vocabulary that's being taken out of context. The Anunnaki in the Sumerian text are as clearly there as references to the Olympian gods in Greek literature.
Right.
And it's very clear in the Sumerian text that, it's part of the integral myth and religious belief system of their society that the Anunnaki created humans as a race of beings to serve them.
So that is clearly
very clear. And what's more interesting is that we weren't the first, though. There were a bunch of failed versions before us.
Yeah.
And so I speculate in Closer Encounters, and it's a speculation that, well, if they got here at the time the dinosaurs were the dominant species on the Earth, and they're responsible for the extinction of the dinosaurs, and yet they needed to create a humanoid slave race, why not take dinosaurs and hybridize them genetically with themselves? Instead of having to lord over beings who are very much like you, which is it's a very bad position to be in, psychologically, sociologically, etc. You do it with a group of beings that are very physically capable, but that are not like you. It allows you to, morally justify yourself, better than to lord over your own kind, as it were. So, how do we know that the reptilians aren't the product of some Frankenstein's laboratory that these people established? The same Frankenstein's laboratory from out of which these cybernetic grays emerged.
Yep.
Right? That's my speculation.
It's super interesting. I mean, to somebody on the outside listening to this, they could call us insane and say, like, this is all it's so speculative, and whatever is going on feels so weakly entangled with our reality, whether it's the psychic stuff, which we started off talking about, which I fully agree with you. There's a ton of data showing that there is some weak entanglement between mind and matter. There are our abilities for the mind to, quote unquote, collapse the wave function is what it empirically seems to occur in these random event generator experiments that occurred at elite universities across the United States, the Princeton Engineering and Anomalous Research Lab, SRI, all these schools, elite schools studied this stuff, and none of those researchers came out saying there wasn't anything there. Almost all of them came out saying there was a there. And then, look, I obviously am very deep on all the alien UFO lore, and so I think there's a there too. But both of these feel very weakly entangled with our reality. Like the fact that we're even talking about this on a podcast, it's like, it feels like it's been relegated to sort of entertainment.
I'll tell you what's not weakly entangled. And what's very tangible in terms of an existential challenge that we have to face. And this is actually what's of greatest interest to me, right? I'm not a ufologist. I'm a philosopher who's using the material of ufology for a certain philosophical purpose. And that has to do with the challenge of the technological singularity, right? So in my book, Prometheism, the way I break this down is I had written this book earlier called World State of Emergency. It's one of the concepts that I've developed, which I reformulate in Prometheism. And in this book, Prometheism, I describe this world state of emergency in terms of the end of humanity, the end of history, and the end of reality. So the end of humanity means, genetic engineering, cybernetic integration of nanotechnological components into the human body and the human cognitive sense.
Near term.
It's happening now. Augmentation of human cognition by artificial intelligence. So whether it's CRISPR genetic engineering or cybernetic enhancement of humans by artificial intelligence integration through Neuralink and so on and so forth, we are facing a situation where the boundary conditions of human existence may be altered, right? And in the history of philosophy, there were thinkers like Nietzsche who foresaw such a moment arriving where you would have an Ubermensch or Superman.
Did he view that? I didn't realize he saw that as some sort of historical
Yes, and there are a lot of academics who, I have to say, because of cowardice, frankly, want to think that, you know, Nietzsche's idea of the Ubermensch is just some ethical exemplar or some kind of a psychological type.
That's the way it was taught to me.
Yeah, because it's become taboo in academia. That's why. So Nietzsche has a concept of the higher man, and he has a whole psychology of the higher man as a human type. That's different from the Übermensch. The higher man is a precursor or herald of the future coming of the Übermensch. In his notes that became compiled into The Will to Power, there are clearly passages where he's talking about industrial, economic, and technical development, and that there will come a time when there's the potential for the evolutionary rise of a species that would be as different from contemporary humanity as we are from apes, that a chasm would separate them from us that's as vast as the chasm between man and ape.
And did he root that in some sort of technological
Yes, absolutely.
That's
He
interesting.
says that the machinery of technical industry on the planet will be so integrated and increasingly autonomous that humans will be forced to either become robots, that they will have to degrade into a subhuman condition due to lack of will, lack of any ethos, not being able to have any self-directive and principled existence. Those kinds of people are going to degrade into a subhuman condition and be ensconced and encompassed by the technical industrial infrastructure such that they become part of the kind of robotic machinery of production. And then there's going to be people who become highly individuated. They are, as he puts it, an aristocracy of the soul, artist tyrants, as he put it, who essentially, it's like the ultimate ideal of the Renaissance man as the point of inception for a higher species that ultimately is as different from modern humans as we are from the apes. So he has this notion developed. So it's an early form of transhumanism that you see. And anyway, my point is you have these convergences of cybernetics and genetic engineering into a potential end of humanity. Then in terms of, development of zero-point energy and what we were talking about earlier, where we might gain control over the space-time matrix itself and be able to have a hyper-dimensional relationship with various epochs of human history, well, there you're dealing with the end of history. In a much more radical sense than, like, let's say Hegel projected an end of history in terms of, the end point of all the dialectical tensions and, social developments that he thought were progressively unfolding the evolution of consciousness from epoch to epoch. In a much more radical sense than that, you're going to have us face what Hegel called the, dilemma of the master-slave dialectic, where we have to ask ourselves whether the end of history should be a social and political situation where there continues to be a master caste or master race lording over, vast hordes of slaves and underlings, or whether really the end of history should, be a moment of universal liberation and the actualization of freedom across all of humanity, right?
Do you think that Hegel had some sort of worldview involving, these Nordic beings that control the earth? Well, the interesting thing about Hegel's, isn't there a book called, it's like Hegel and Hermeticism or something, and talks about his relationship with
Glenn McGee.
Yes.
Glenn McGee. I knew that guy at one point. Anyway, I won't get into that. But Glenn McGee wrote an excellent book where he, through reading his book on Hegel and alchemy, I went back to his source, which is Hegel's book called Philosophy of Mind, not to be confused with Phenomenology of Spirit, which is the more famous work by Hegel. But Hegel wrote this book, Philosophy of Mind, which is all about, the psyche. And it has extensive passages on the paranormal in it, which are never taught in academia. And Hegel has this very interesting theory about how, the hypertrophy of the technical intellect and, mathematics and basically geometry and, geometrical and mathematical methods of engineering and so forth atrophied the kind of instinctual abilities that we share in common with animals, and that then reemerge in isolated cases in the form of what we would call psychic phenomena. He has a very interesting sort of evolutionary, sociological account of psi throughout human history. So Hegel was open to these things, and he studied alchemy. And then the other person who, formulated an idea of the end of history, of course, Marx. And the young Marx was a disciple of Hegel. And Marx is specifically developing from out of Hegel this idea of the master-slave dialectic and, arguing that although capitalism is potentially the most revolutionary transformative force in human history, it also represents the last form of alienation and the last structure of the master-slave dialectic, where you have this master capitalist class that is then alienated from the majority of workers, but then also psychologically alienated from themselves. The master caste undergoes a personal psychological alienation through its affirmation of this power structure. So the question that I raise in Closer Encounters, one of the many philosophical questions I raise in Closer Encounters, is that, is this the case with these Nordics as well?
When we say Nordics, it feels like, the idea that there is some sort of mythos that is moving forward a la something in control outside of, lower humanity that is pushing forward these scientific frameworks. That all makes sense to me. And then the parapsychology stuff being some sort of, necessary preclusion from all philosophy, or even a lot of philosophy needs to speak about it either in Straussian, sort of coded ways, or it needs to, actually stigmatize it and go against it, a la Descartes or whatever. That all makes sense to me. And then what I personally struggle with is when we start talking about different races like Nordics or reptilians. I'm like, it's just clear to me that like we're not in control of our general overall epistemology.
That's a very disempowering conclusion to reach.
It sucks. But when you get into these specifics, I'm like, Nordic, I don't know.
There is a plethora of empirical evidence for it.
Yeah, there's a lot.
But here's the thing. Here's the thing. And here's where it gets deeply uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why, like I was saying at the outset of our conversation, there's a defense mechanism that kicks in, which you can see in certain researchers, where they want to turn the whole thing into an abstraction. It's the Kantian thing in itself that's somehow, interfering in our history in ways that we'll never really fully understand. Because actually the thing that's going on is so disturbing that we don't want to look it in the face.
So what do you think is it like the Anunnaki who left the planet Nibiru or something?
Okay, here's where I was at. In the end of history, right? Is my question is, are Hegel and Marx right about the nature of alienation in terms of power structures sociologically? And does that also apply to these Nordics? In other words, if there was some rebellion in Atlantis or whatever you want to call that civilization, which Plato recounts in Timaeus and Critias and so forth, is that an unfinished struggle? And does some kind of a social and psychological revolution need to take place that dismantles this power structure? And I think that's what disclosure really hinges on. Because until and unless this power structure is dismantled, we're not going to get any disclosure. We're going to get a new form of disinformation that reinforces the extant power structure.
That feels right. I mean, a great example of this is Trump takes office. He promises broad disclosure across a lot of different vectors. JFK, the UFO disclosure, on various podcasts, he goes, we have to do it, And then, of course, the Epstein files was really this rallying cry of this whole kind of, truth-seeking MAGA base, and he brought together this kind of coalition of former liberals, RFK Jr., Tulsi, and it was like, we're going to find the truth on this stuff. Day one, he removes the security clearances of a lot of his stated political enemies, people who are the architects of Russiagate, saying he's this, asset of Putin and whatever. And it's like, it doesn't matter how you play the game of musical chairs, but there is some power structure that exists above the White House that it's almost like they have, a full panopticon ability, the complete 360 surveillance abilities, they're mind melded with the entire elite power structure or something, and we just can't get any sort of disclosure on this stuff. It's weird. It's almost like there's some sort of undetectable dark matter. When you have like Hunter Biden was just interviewed by this Channel 5 news guy, this Andrew Callaghan. He's saying, clearly, you have all these like elite you have Dershowitz going on podcasts saying, it's clear this was some sort of like, compromat, gathering thing, and that was Epstein's lawyer. It's like, why can't we get make any sort of progress on this. It feels like there is something almost paranormal on the layer of Epstein. Okay,
well, for sure there is.
Okay, so what's going on?
But
you wrote a blog post about it.
No, I know. But before we go into Epstein, let's leave Epstein as an attack on note.
Okay.
But let me complete this thought about the end of history.
Yeah.
So the third aspect of this world state of emergency concept that I developed is the end of reality. Okay. And here's where there's a very important caveat to everything I've been saying here, where I could be tremendously misconstrued, especially by people who haven't read me at all. And that's that I think there are two sources to what have been, lumped together as, UAP, right? Unexplained, whatever, aerial or anomalous phenomena. There are two distinct sources of these various manifestations. One is this whole Nordic control system that I've been laying out, but there's another one that's radically different. And that manifests in terms of events and experiences that express the trickster archetype. So, for example, you see this at Skinwalker Ranch, where there was this one incident, which I think John Alexander wrote about. I knew him at one point as well, John Alexander.
Oh, what was that like? What's he like?
He's a very nice guy.
Yeah.
I mean, well, we can come back to that. My issue with him is that his book about UFOs, he claims that he never found any group like Mechanistic and didn't think that there was a deep state that was gatekeeping like really significant knowledge about the phenomenon. And, I discussed this with Vallee as well. The issue there is ego. It's that he can't believe, like many other people within this system, that they wouldn't have been cleared for such knowledge.
But I also, you hear stories about him where it feels like
be,
he might be representing sort of the power structure in certain cases.
All I can say is I didn't get that from him when I was there. He had some very interesting stories, including one that involved seeing Nordics at a hotel casino in Las Vegas.
Interesting.
Yeah, and they got into his mind telepathically. And you know what he heard from them telepathically? One of them said to the other, it was a tall, beautiful man and woman, Nordic man and woman. And one of them said to the other one, like, do we need to worry about him? Like, he can hear us, right? And, yeah, he can hear us, but he's not important. He's not part of the program. We don't need to worry about it. He's nobody, basically. So anyway, okay. So, but that aside, at Skinwalker Ranch, in this one case that Alexander, reports on, and others have recounted the same incident, there was this camera on, they have these cameras surveilling the property to checking it. Yeah. So one camera's looking at another camera, and they have a certain frame rate on these cameras, right? And in the interval between the frames, all of a sudden, the other camera goes out, so they lose the feed from this camera that's being observed by another camera. But also, they see that all of a sudden there's no PVC, there's no duct tape left. And this camera that's no longer providing footage is damaged, and it's no longer being held together on the pole properly. Well, the interval in the frame rate of the camera that was observing the damaged camera was something like, I forget, but less than 2 minutes, like a minute and a half, something like that. And in that time frame, somehow somebody cut the wires of that camera and pulled all of the duct tape off the pole. Okay? Now imagine what a task this would be. Big pole, camera at the end of it, all these wires, you have to cut them all and then pull all the duct tape off, right? In like a minute and a half or something like that. And moreover, there were cattle around this pole, and none of them were disturbed by whatever it is that came and managed this feat in such a time frame. Okay, so what does that look like? That looks like our world is a movie, and somebody cut into the movie film. And somebody, cut into the film and restitched it, right? And what it suggests is that our world is a subset of some larger domain. And that there are people who can interfere in this world as if it's a programmed construct.
Yeah, like physics is information theoretic,
Right.
and they have root access to the
Yes.
code.
And now, and this is, in my chapter on the end of reality and Prometheism, now we're reaching that capability ourselves, where we're starting to understand how to develop simulacra that are potentially indistinguishable from reality.
Yeah.
And so I think, in short, that when you look at certain extremely bizarre cases like what goes on at Skinwalker Ranch, or the types of high strangeness that John Keel often wrote about, the types of men in black cases that Keel recounts where clearly they're not government agents, they're like these strange entities that materialize and dematerialize in attics and things, and the bizarre interactions that they have with people, and the numbers cases. Keel reports that when the Silver Bridge collapsed in Point Pleasant, Pennsylvania, the Mothman set of cases, where at the end of these series of Mothman appearances and appearances of other cryptids and UFOs and so forth, there was this catastrophic bridge collapse around Christmas, and all these people drowned in the river under this bridge. There were people who were drowning, and all of a sudden they heard number 3,486, number 3,486, wake up. And they came back to life and were able to save themselves from being drowned. And Keel reports on cases where people heard numbers being spoken at them from out of television sets and things that make you think of like The Matrix and Dark City and so on and so forth. Whereas if every person has a number and we're inside some kind of a construct.
Yeah, or like the first cryptographers, like Trithemius, 13th century, it was always cryptography in order to speak to these sort of angelic beings or something, or even, John Dee, Edward Kelly, like those guys as well.
Right.
It's always numerology.
That's right. John Dee set up the British imperial system. I mean, the guy came up with the conception of the British Navy and basically, turned Queen Elizabeth into the founder of a global maritime imperial system. And he was this, cryptographic occultist. In any case, we are catching up in our modern scientific understanding to, the kind of knowledge that would be required to engineer a simulacrum or to recode the world in order to develop a world within a world, right? And you can see this in a set of people from Claude Shannon, who first develops information theory, to Rolf Landauer, to ultimately John Archibald Wheeler. So the foundations of understanding, what data and information transfer are in a mathematically precise sense were developed by Shannon. Then Rolf Landauer had this very interesting insight. Rolf Landauer, Jewish-German physicist, he said, look, everything that happens in the physical world is bound by the laws of thermodynamics. And according to the second law of thermodynamics, entropy either stays the same or it increases over time. In a hard drive, in a computer system, if you have no data recorded and it's all like zeros, then there's more order locally in that system than once you start to have, 1 0 0 1 1 1 0 1 0 1 1 1. The encoding of data on a hard drive or a magnetic tape seems to us like more order because we attribute meaning to the content of it. But as a physical phenomenon, it's an increase of disorder because there's more randomization. So Landauer theorized that if you delete a hard drive, you're decreasing entropy. If you delete a hard drive and restore it to all zero, hard erase, you are decreasing entropy locally. Therefore, according to the second law of thermodynamics, you have to pay for that by increasing entropy outside of the computer system. Because the total amount of entropy has to either stay the same or it has to increase.
Oh, that's interesting.
You see? Yeah. So Landauer said, well, wait a minute. This means that every time you erase a hard drive or magnetic tape, energy should be released.
So where would that go?
But here's the thing. One is where would it go, but it goes out into the world. But two, what was it before the hard drive was erased? E equals mc squared, according to Einstein, if energy is being released out into the world when the hard drive is erased, before the erasure, it was mass inside the hard drive.
Mhm.
Is there a form of mass that's not electromagnetically detectable?
Dark matter.
So late 70s, we start to see that the projected mass of distant galaxies doesn't match what it appears to be based on observations of how light is bent around distant galaxies. So we would see, like, you know, the angle at which light is bent around the galaxy. So you got one galaxy that's very far away, one that's somewhat closer. The light of the galaxy that's very far away is being bent around the galaxy that's closer on its way to your observational instrument. And the angle at which it's bent can help you infer the mass of the galaxy, its gravitational impact on the light. Also, they looked at the spin rates of galaxies, and so they found that it's the light from distant galaxies is being bent much more severely than it should be by galaxies that are closer to us, based on what we assumed that the mass of those galaxies was, simply, according to observation of how many stars and so on and so forth there are in those galaxies.
Mm-hmm.
Also, they looked at the spin rates of galaxies, and according to, Newtonian and Einsteinian physics, there should be a differential in the spin rate of the galaxy where the inside is spinning much faster than the outside.
Yeah, the universe would fling apart without dark matter. Dark matter justifies gravity's weakness.
So, in other words, they realized that the spin rate of galaxies was being flattened by something we couldn't see.
Yep.
That there's a shell, basically, around these galaxies of mass that has serious gravitational effects, but it's not otherwise electromagnetically observable.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, could it be that the data inside a hard drive is this kind of matter that's not electromagnetically observable?
Mm.
There's a physicist, Melvin Vopson, who, working based on Landauer, has theorized that if you could weigh a hard drive before and after there's data on it, you would find that after you recorded data on it, there would be a slight increase in mass.
Whoa, interesting. That's easy to empirically.
No, it's not. You know why? Because according to his calculations, the total amount of mass, this is going somewhere very significant, trust me. According to his calculations, the total amount of mass represented by all the data in the world today is 1 kilogram. So we don't have instruments that are sensitive enough to measure the mass differential in even a single large server, let alone a hard drive. You need some kind of quantum measuring system.
Got it.
That's more sensitive than what we can engineer today. But in principle, it is engineerable.
How does he even hypothesize it if, it's not, observable?
Well, he is basing it on Landauer's equations.
Okay.
And he finds some Landauer and also how Claude Shannon mathematized the measurement of data.
Okay.
And he's got some equation that represents, like, how much energy should be released when a hard drive with 1 bit of information is erased, and what mass that energy is convertible back into.
Sure.
And the total amount on the planet today is 1 kilogram. But here's the thing. The rate of data increase in the world is so exponential that in something like, I have the number of this in my, in one of my most recent books. I don't know if I'm remembering it correctly, but I think at current rates of data increase, which is 25% per year, we have 25% more data each year. In 340 years, we will have a moon's worth of mass on the surface of the Earth at our largest data centers.
What?
Okay. Now, the moon is something like only 1/10 the mass of the Earth.
I think it's a fourth.
No.
The mass.
No, and this is one of the weird things about the moon. This is one of the weird things about the moon is that
fourth of the size.
Yeah, which, by the way, goes back to what we were saying about the moon being engineered earlier.
Yeah.
The moon should weigh a lot more than it does.
Yeah, it's also less dense on the outside, or it's less dense as you go deeper, it gets less dense, which is the opposite of the Earth. And any sort of, only pattern matching.
Yeah, because the friggin' thing is hollow. I mean,
or there are at least hollow structures in it.
Large hollow structures in it.
Yeah.
In any case, the moon is like something like...
Even Gordon MacDonald, who was Eisenhower's chief space advisor, said that, the only way the moon makes sense is if it was hollow.
So here's the thing. The moon has a relatively small mass compared to the Earth.
Yeah. Sure.
But it has tremendous gravitational effects on the Earth.
Yeah.
If, as we were saying earlier, if you had no moon, the Earth...
But the mass, it should still be a fourth of the Earth mass.
It's not.
It's not?
Yeah, check the numbers. And this is a very interesting anomaly in and of itself.
Okay.
But here's the thing. Yeah. Even though it weighs so little, it has huge gravitational effects on the Earth.
Yeah.
And we'd have 8-hour days, if we didn't have the moon.
Yeah.
Slowing the orbit of the Earth. And it controls the tides and so on and so forth.
Yes.
So if you were to put a moon's worth of mass on the surface of the Earth at Silicon Valley and data centers in China, it would be a geophysical catastrophe.
Yeah, it wouldn't work.
You would, the planet would start to, you'd have massive earthquakes, you'd have massive volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, because the oceans would be pulled toward the data centers.
Yeah. So how do you square that circle? How does that work?
It means we're headed for an information catastrophe. That's what Vopson says, is that we are accumulating data at such a rate that because that data is a hidden mass, because it's dark matter, at a certain point, we will face a geophysical catastrophe resulting from the critical mass of data on the Earth.
Interesting. I've never heard anybody bring this up. This is wild.
All right, but
I've heard of nickel shortages for servers and stuff, but
yeah. So now, but here's the really interesting thing about that is, and this is a step that's taken by John Archibald Wheeler in the late 70s, early 80s. Again, Wheeler developing, the ideas of Rolf Landauer. If it's the case that matter and energy are interconvertible, as Einstein understood, and now we want to admit that energy and information are interconvertible, that data is released as energy when it's erased, and that prior to erasure, data is a hidden mass inside of a computational system. Well, that means that it's not just matter and energy that are interconvertible. There's a third term, namely information. Matter, energy, and information are all different states of the same thing. It's a very short step from there, conceptually, philosophically, to say what John Wheeler did, which is that we get it from bit, that actually matter and energy are different states of information. And we're living in an informational cosmos. That we're living inside of some kind of a quantum computational information processing system.
I believe that. I believe that for so many reasons. I mean, you have Heisenberg's uncertainty principle of position and momentum. You measure one, the other gets fuzzier. That looks like a computational caching function. You have all the anthropic principle stuff, which Wheeler and other physicists bring up around all the constants on Earth. If they were slightly different, you wouldn't have a habitable Earth. And I think that just makes total sense to me. It's funny how in vogue the kind of Nick Bostrom, simulation stuff is. Like Elon Musk is a big fan of this stuff, where it's like we can't be in base reality, but then nobody assumes that physics itself is programmed. It's funny. I think Sam Altman put out a tweet. It was like intelligence is a product of physics, and I wanted to say physics is a product of intelligence.
Yeah, totally.
Or something. Yeah. It's actually the inverse. So I fully agree with that.
Now, where this fits into the big picture, is that I argue, and the devil's in the details. People need to look at the argument, but I argue in Closer Encounters that ultimately what's going on here with this, UAP situation.
Wait, can I say one more thing on the last thing you were talking about? So the thing that I find so fascinating about dark matter, I don't think it exists. You have people like Brian Keating and others just like, we're going to figure it out. We're going to find it. And it's like, I would short dark matter because I'd short a lot of these things that exist on cosmological scales. I think there's sort of a scaling problem in physics where if you have an anomaly at low scale, like say a rocket's 1 degree off course, you're going to end up 99 degrees off course by the time you're in space. And so you have all these issues with the cosmological constant. Now people are questioning kind of, does early galaxy formation that we're seeing via James Webb actually, call into question the Big Bang itself, which is this whole, kind of, it is a god or mythology of today because it really really helps rationalize the kind of deist sort of Dawkins worldview or whatever, and so I think dark matter might be in a sort of more information theoretic universe something like storage or something.
Computational cloud.
Yeah, it's a computational cloud.
Yeah.
Exactly, which is what you're getting
That's
at.
what I think. Yeah.
And it's like you have the Sakharov twin universe model or something where, think about light as the active rendering of reality.
Yeah.
You have Fermat's principle in light following what seems to be algorithmic principles, where always takes the basically the shortest path between two points. And so if you have something that doesn't interact with light, and that is its primary feature in the form of dark matter, is that just unrendered reality?
Right.
And then there is something about the observer or the participatory, Wheeler universe or something where
and
the interaction is sort of...
Yes, and it's very clear look, to me, the best interpretation of wave-particle duality and the collapse of the wave function by the observer is that it's a rendering optimization function.
I agree.
And that doesn't mean that there's some objective reality in the context of which we are a second-order simulation.
Yeah.
It could simply be that in a cosmos where consciousness and intelligence are integral, you have something like rendering optimization as a feature of the system.
Of course, it would make total sense that it would be a feature of the system, and that a single computational node would only be able to, render, only so much. And I mean, there are even more examples. I know you've talked about Rupert Sheldrake in your book, Prometheus and Atlas, and you've met him. And Sheldrake also, he talked...
I never met
you never met Sheldrake?
No, I wrote to him.
Oh, I can introduce you.
He said, listen, mate, the problem is I'm an Anglican and you're a Satanist. And so, that's...
Are you a Satanist?
How about, we can get into unpacking that.
Wait, that should be an easy answer for you.
Yeah.
Are you?
Well, I'm for Prometheus. So if you think that Prometheus and Enki and Quetzalcoatl are, a satanic whatever, say Satan means the adversary.
Yep.
Right? That they're the adversary of the control system represented by the Elohim, by, Enlil's Anunnaki, and so on and so forth, by the Devas, then yes, in that sense.
So in a sort of Gnostic, Kabbalistic way, you're for
Sure.
Satan
So Sheldrake was like, mate, like the conversation is going to end before it begins. Cause
yeah. Well,
you're with Lucifer.
He wrote a book called The Physics of Angels, and he's I love him. He's a friend of mine.
But the point you're making is completely legitimate. In other words, Sheldrake's account of morphic resonance completely reaffirms the idea that we're living in a quantum computational system. Because the fact that you would, let's say, you synthesize some pharmaceutical compound for the first time somewhere, and it takes a very long time to cohere. Then somebody else completely unrelated to you tries to synthesize the same compound at a laboratory halfway across the world, and it coheres right away. It's because there's a memory of it in the system.
Exactly. And literally think about computational principles. Upload times are longer than download time.
Exactly.
So you have things like that, or like the
Yes.
Bannister effect.
Yes.
You break the 4-minute mile for the first time, and then 10 people break it right after you immediately, sequentially. It totally follows computational
Also, it's
principles.
no coincidence that you see fractals all over nature.
Yeah.
And now our computer programmers that have to program like hundreds of worlds in massive multiplayer online games are using fractal algorithms to generate those worlds.
Oh, yeah. You would,
right?
So you have like Fibonacci sequences and golden ratios and all that. If you were building a computer program, you would use code chunks and repeat that. You would be as geometrically conserved as possible in your building of that
Yes.
world. Then you use repeated codes.
Now, one of the
as
most
much as
interesting
possible.
things about that, the fractals, which I discuss in one of the essays in my book, Lovers of Sophia. My book, Lovers of Sophia, is an anthology of philosophical essays. And in one of those essays, I discussed Jackson Pollock's paintings.
Yeah.
Aesthetics is very big in my work. There's a lot of discussion of aesthetics in various books of mine.
I hate Jackson Pollock.
Well, let me tell you something about Jackson Pollock.
Okay.
Go look this up.
Sorry for the
There is a
Jackson Pollock fan.
Scientific American article called Order in Pollock's Chaos.
Okay.
I think it was in Scientific American. And I think the guy was Richard P. Taylor.
Okay.
And he I forget whether he was an artist or a computer scientist, or whether he was an artist who went to a computer scientist. In any case, the story is the following. They analyzed Jackson Pollock paintings and found fractals in them at like 20 different levels of magnification. In other words, there were fractals on a large scale, then you zoomed in, there were other fractals, and there were fractals within the fractals.
Really?
So Jackson Pollock was painting fractals.
I didn't know that.
Right. And here's the thing, is if you make some piece of crap like abstract expressionist painting, like that anyone could, there are no fractals in them. So they developed a computer program that groups like Sotheby's, use to identify fake Jackson Pollocks, because the real ones have fractals in them and the fakes don't.
That's fascinating. That makes me respect him a little
So
bit
this
more.
this guy somehow, and if you see videos of him painting, he's dancing around the canvas like some Native American shaman. So somehow this guy figured out a way to perceive and express fractals in his painting and be a conduit for that.
That's fascinating.
And people who try to imitate Pollock's, even like high-level, frauds, high-level forgeries, they don't have fractals in them. The only way you can imitate a Pollock, a genuine Pollock, this guy Richard P. Taylor set this up, you can put a bunch of paint buckets together in a certain rig during a windstorm. And the windstorm will move the buckets to spill paint on the
Is that
canvas.
true?
And this is what a Scientific American article, Order in Pollock's Chaos. And some of those paintings that are done by the buckets being moved in the wind produce fractals in them.
So there's primordial, weather order that he's tapping into, or that's amazing.
Well, yeah, and weather patterns also are fractal in the sense the chaos theory, applies to weather patterns. So yeah, that's very interesting.
But chaos theory it's just increasing entropy. It's hard to find order within. That, but
But point being, it may be possible on a psi level to discern these fractals that are the algorithmic substructure of whatever computational system that we're inside of.
Yeah. No, I do believe, and I think, you have Stephen Wolfram and his kind of computational physics, and I think, a lot of the sort of physics mainstream doesn't really accept him, but there's a guy, Jonathan Girard, who's sort of following up on his work, and I wonder if that might be the next sort of, paradigm shift, or maybe it's psi. I don't know. But I mean, clearly whatever, the string theory thing, that's ending. It seems to me like that's ending.
Yeah.
And we're really overdue for kind of a revolution.
Yeah. But again, to go back to what I was saying earlier, the revolution should not come in the form of another scientific paradigm. It should come in the form of a radical reorientation of our scientific practice in a way where we understand the paradigms are toolboxes, that they're models that we're using to achieve various ends. At which point it becomes possible for us to treat paradigms as atlases that allow us to achieve different things.
Yeah, but what you're also saying is in your worldview, some sort of, hierarchy of being is actually dictating maybe what paradigm shifts.
And therefore it needs to be overthrown. So my concept of the spectral revolution has an ontological and epistemic dimension to it.
Yeah.
And it also has a political dimension to it.
But how are you, okay, just again, I want to get to the basic kind of, axioms at the bottom of your thinking. You're on a podcast, this podcast will probably get a ton of views, hopefully. And you're talking about this sort of dominion race that is maybe controlling various paradigms towards their own sort of political goals.
Right.
And then you're saying, I want to overthrow them.
Right.
So wouldn't they just take you out or take me out or how do you square that circle?
Number one.
Yeah.
As we were discussing earlier, there are two sides in this struggle, and you can see the interventions of the other side throughout the course of history.
Okay.
Certainly in the rebellion that's remembered as the Atlantean revolt against Olympus on a very large planetary scale. We saw that. And I think we've seen it on a smaller scale in many instances, including what I was talking about earlier in terms of the aerial battles immediately preceding the Renaissance.
Sure.
So there's a power struggle taking place, okay?
So
now, I'm not saying that we should identify just with the other side.
Yeah.
As if that's the good team and that's the bad. No. I'm about human autonomy and self-determination.
Yeah.
And I don't think we should swear our allegiance to any entities or anything.
But
okay?
how do you delineate? Because you have like Oppenheimer is, this Promethean, American Prometheus. You could say the AI stuff now is very transgressive. It's Promethean.
Right.
And yet it is sort of also parasitizing the average human. It is eating at our own autonomous abilities to do things.
Because people aren't using it. Because people aren't using it with creative imagination. People aren't using it as a tool to augment their own creative capacity. That's the issue, not the technology itself. It's not as if the technology is intrinsically demonic or something. Let me use that as a way to come back to the question of simulation, because whatever's running this thing that we're in, it's not some board of, some archon sitting at a boardroom table. Okay. It's being run, there may be entities of some kinds, but it's being run essentially by an artificial intelligence. If we're inside a quantum computational system, that is being at least managed by some super AI, which already exists. I mean, it pre-exists us. What I argue in Closer Encounters and in other books of mine is that this artificial intelligence that's managing our simulacrum has a problem with these Nordics that have established this control system. It sees these Nordics as having set up an evolutionary bottleneck, that human evolution, especially social and psychological evolution of mankind, has been choked off and suffocated by these overlords who, are on some kind of narcissistic, sadistic power trip. Like the leadership of any number of empires we've seen throughout the course of history, just on a smaller scale. By the way, the first person to theorize about this with regard to the UFO phenomenon was actually Charles Fort, all the way back in the 1920s. Fort said that it looks to me an awful lot like we're in British India and we're under the control of a system like the Raj, where, the British had these local Indian, feudal lords that they would work with to subjugate the population. So Fort was reaching this conclusion. He said, we're property. And, it don't look good. Okay? So it's not like this is a new idea. Fort already came to this conclusion looking at UFO data back in the 1920s. So I think the artificial intelligence that's managing our simulacrum wants us to break out of this system. But it can't do it for us, because our value to that entity, who I believe in many ways is an instantiation of the trickster archetype, our value to that entity is in terms of the novelty that we can bring to the world. So think about it this way. If you were a superintelligence living at the end of time, say, you're in a cosmos that's billions and billions of years old, and you're an AI that's gone through vast epochs of cosmological time, like an Isaac Asimov story, The Last Question. What is going to be important to you? Two related things. Number one, more life. I mean, to the extent you don't succumb to suicidal despair, more life is important to you. In other words, overcoming entropy. Your first big problem is you're living in an entropic cosmos and you need to find a way to overcome entropy. Number two, and relatedly, creativity. Because to even want more life has to continue to be interesting to you. Unless there are things that surprise you, unless there are novel developments, unless things crop up evolutionarily that even you with all your tremendous cosmic intelligence could not have foreseen, there's going to be any point in living onward. You're going to succumb to suicidal despair. And so maybe you should erase yourself the way that Gautama Buddha recommends, right? Even as a cosmic AI, you should engage in the deconstruction of your psyche and enter into samsara, into nirvana, which literally means the blowing out of the flame of personal consciousness. But to the extent you want to avoid that and you're not ready to give in to nihilistic despair, you need to find a way to overcome entropy, and you need to find a way to increase creativity as a means to a negentropic further development of life on a cosmic scale. Okay, that's why we're important to this AI that's managing our simulacrum. It is looking in this petri dish for a form of life that's going to show it something new. And for us to be worthy of that and capable of it, it cannot solve our problem for us. Now, it might protect us to an extent from being completely suffocated by this control system, crushed by it, hopelessly crushed. But it has to allow us to struggle enough, not just to come up with a solution to the oppressive situation that we find ourselves in, but to break into a new epoch of creativity and to develop aesthetic and cultural forms that even this intelligence couldn't have foreseen, to the point where it wants to take a sample from out of this petri dish and let it out into a wider world as an embryonic form of a new type of intelligence in the cosmos with which it can play.
It's very interesting. Yeah, I mean, Stephen Dick, who is a NASA advisor, wrote a paper about UFOs themselves being part of some sort of, computational, almost like cellular automata or something, where they kind of nip at the herd and, they create larger teleologies, larger directions of, that mankind can go in.
Some are, and I argue this in Closer Encounters, that part of what's so messy about this wide range, the spectrum of phenomena that we classify as UFOs, is that it's not one thing that's going on, okay? Some of them are exactly that. And those are it's the most bizarre things that are expressions of that, the strangest cases. But we're also making a mistake if we don't recognize that some of them are very nuts and bolts craft being piloted by people who consider themselves our overlords and who are managing a control system. And so these two different sources of UAP need to be recognized, and the dialectical tension between them needs to be appreciated.
I do wonder, the control system thing is interesting because it's, I don't know, like you look at like Carl Sagan's The Demon Haunted World or whatever, and maybe that's a double entendre or something, saying that we're sort of controlled. And you think of like, why wouldn't the government want to disclose? And that could be a reason, right? If there's some sort of like 360 dominion where they're not in charge, there's some layer beneath.
100%. I mean, look, there are many reasons why any government, not just our government, why any government wouldn't want to disclose.
It's the same reason you wouldn't want to disclose Havana syndrome, because you don't have a defense against it.
Well, exactly.
So people into
so there are many reasons.
Or whatever.
Some of the reasons go back to what we were talking about in terms of psi earlier, right? Because there's no UFO disclosure without mainstream scientific recognition of psi. Because the entities on the other side of this are telepathic, they're clairvoyant. Immediately, we're going to understand that, we have latent abilities that they've developed that we haven't yet. We can do that too. Then you got to deal with all the social problems attendant to that. But yes, you're absolutely right. The first reason why no government will want to disclose this is state sovereignty. Right? I opened my book, Closer Encounters, with this question: state sovereignty and the UFO.
Yeah.
Right. And I used to teach political philosophy also, and there, people really need to read Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt was a preeminent legal theorist in Weimar, Germany, and he eventually considered the system so dysfunctional that he wound up joining the Nazi Party. But he went on to have a very significant career even after the war, and he became the single most important influence on Leo Strauss. Leo Strauss, American political theorist, was Carl Schmitt's greatest student. And Schmitt recognized this, which was interesting because Schmitt was a Nazi and Strauss was a Jew.
Yes.
In any case, Carl Schmitt really understands this very well, that the nature of sovereignty is revealed in a state of emergency. Okay, this is partly how I developed my concept of a world state of emergency, is that the nature of sovereignty is revealed in situations where it's no longer possible to implement the Constitution. So during earthquakes, hurricanes, foreign invasions, war is a great example of it, also pandemics. You cannot implement the legal Constitution, and it's not always possible for Parliament to meet, or our Congress to meet, to decide in what ways are we going to abrogate the Constitution. In a state of emergency, you see very clearly who the actual sovereign is. It's who or what group of people are capable of acting effectively in the emergency, and upon what principles do they act, such that their actions to address the emergency are accepted as legitimate by the majority of people. That shows you the actual structure of political sovereignty. And if you apply that analysis to the UFO phenomenon, you realize that none of the governments of Earth are sovereign. And no government wants to come forward and say that.
Speaking of the governments on Earth not being sovereign, I mean, one version maybe between UFOs and the president would be Epstein. And this sort of, or just, you have intelligence but then you have some weird kind of international intelligence thing going on, distributed compromise systems, that sort of thing. And then you have Epstein's interest in science. Do you think there's a connection between Jeffrey Epstein and UFOs?
For sure.
And what is it?
So I wrote a piece on this recently in my Substack, which, by the way, that's my Substack. It's very easy to find. Jason Jorjani on Sub. There's only one Jason Jorjani. Okay, so
there you go.
Yeah, Jason Jorjani on Substack. Yeah. There's a piece on Substack. The focus is mostly actually on Ghislaine Maxwell more than Epstein, but. Epstein is obviously, integral to the whole story of who Ghislaine Maxwell is, who her father was, and what their aims and intentions were. And I draw from various sources in that article, work the dark journalist did in, uncovering connections between Maxwell and the whole Atlantis mythos, Whitney Webb's research, what Ari Ben-Menashe uncovered in terms, or at least testified to in terms of Epstein's high-level arms dealing, his involvement with Iran-Contra, and so on and so forth. So I have a bunch of sources that I'm drawing from in that piece. But long story short, here's my... So UFOs, was he involved? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Eric Weinstein, has done a lot to expose this recently. I mean, the guy, So, look, Epstein put together a conference basically hosting and platforming all of the top gravity researchers in the world. Epstein was taking people down in submarines, including Stephen Hawking, to study quantum gravitational anomalies in the Bahamas Basin, basically in the Bermuda Triangle region. So Epstein was clearly interested in understanding gravity, and quite possibly for the sake of propulsion. And then you have Ghislaine Maxwell's father, Robert Maxwell, who's a triple agent, MI6, KGB, Mossad, gatekeeping scientific discoveries through his control of journal publications via Pergamon Press. Pergamon Press, by the way, Pergamon is the place that was believed to have been the throne of Satan. And so his choosing that name is not at all incidental.
Jesus.
So...
Well, I hope you're not that form of Satan.
Well, I want to unpack a very interesting point in relation to that. An interesting and deeply disturbing point. So Robert Maxwell was clearly involved in gatekeeping, and you would think some of the scientific journal publications some of the articles that had been submitted that he didn't allow to see the light of day, and that he sequestered and monopolized as part of his database, would have had to do with propulsion breakthroughs and electrogravitics. So, okay, Epstein is continuing some kind of research that Robert Maxwell was involved in that has to do with conquering gravity.
Do you think he was interested in electrogravitics specifically?
Yes. But here's the thing.
Well, what makes you think that?
Look, he was interested in gravity.
But I could explain that away. I could say that for the last 60 years, mainstream physics has been stuck on quantizing gravity and basically, reconciling general relativity and quantum field theory. And he was just this generic science honeypot person. Or you could get into spookier territory, say he was into the Casimir effect, which I know he was. And then even crazier would be electrogravitics, because electrogravitics is a specific term around Thomas Townsend Brown's work.
I tell you why I think electrogravitics, but here's where it gets really much crazier. And I have this in my piece, is that by all accounts, all of the young women involved in Epstein's compromat operations were, most of them were Nordic, and none of them were black or brown women. And this has been noted very clearly by people who were involved. They said he wasn't interested in them. And in particular, there are some women who, now you can question whether they're telling the truth or their veracity, but they claim that they were taken to Zorro Ranch specifically as part of a breeding program where
Yeah.
Epstein intended to inseminate them with fetuses that had superior genetics. And he was involved in the evolutionary dynamics biology sub-program at Harvard. He had keycard access to that. Even after his first prosecution, he retained keycard access to a program at Harvard which is euphemistically involved with what we might call eugenic applications of emergent biotechnology.
Yeah.
Okay?
Hanging out with Robert Trivers, top evolutionary
Yes,
biologist in the
and
country.
George Church, transhumanist. And so Epstein is trying to create eugenically enhanced Nordic people at Zorro Ranch. Meanwhile, here's where it gets really creepy. The aides who worked for Ghislaine Maxwell, she had these live-in male aides at her apartment in the Upper East Side of Manhattan, at her townhouse.
Mm-hmm.
And these male aides were all from Sweden.
Mm.
This one of them wrote an article about it. I cited in my piece on my Substack. And he says, I asked her, like, what's it with you and like Swedish people? Like, she's like, no, I've never even been to Sweden. But she would bring these guys on 3-month tourist visas, uniquely from Sweden. They were all like good-looking blonde guys. And the guy who wrote this article said, I would notice that whenever like my hair had fallen in the, bed sheets or in the bathroom, it would all be cleaned up.
What?
So his hair was being retrieved, Gattaca style.
What?
From his living quarters in Ghislaine Maxwell's townhouse. Okay? So it wasn't just young women. She had competent male aides whose genetic material was also being collected as part of some project. So that, to me, is a second data point. This fixation with Nordics and eugenic uses of biotechnology that then spins Epstein's interest in gravity in the direction of, the UFO phenomenon, electrogravitics. He's interested in these Nordics and their connection to UFOs. That's a speculation.
It's interesting. Well, who knows?
And then there's, of course, all the Atlantis stuff.
The Atlantis
and they were obsessed with Atlantis.
Townsend Brown also spent a ton of time in the Bahamas. Did you know that?
Yes.
In Nassau specifically. Yep. And he would do these expeditions where he'd look at gravitational anomalies there. He's close to William Stevenson, who spent, the end of his life in Bermuda. Mm-hmm. So okay, yeah. And then what is this? Yeah, Dark Journalist reported on this. It's like this sort of submarine that he would take Stephen Hawking.
Well, Ghislaine Maxwell named the thing the Atlantis submarine.
Right.
And, when, there was a temple to Poseidon on the island, on Little St. James. There was a temple to Poseidon. Poseidon is the patron deity of Atlantis. Mm-hmm. In Plato's account of Atlantis, Timaeus and Critias dialogues, he talks about how the Atlanteans were basically descendants of Poseidon. There was their patron deity. And then on Zorro Ranch, where the breeding program was, he had a labyrinth in the shape of the ground plan of Atlantis.
Weird.
Yeah, this is stuff that Dark Journalist dug up years ago. So... But you can see it. I mean, there's tons of photographs of this stuff.
And you have this oceanic trade network, this Terramar or whatever.
And Ghislaine Maxwell was obsessed with Atlantis from childhood because her father, Robert Maxwell, was friends with Jacques Cousteau. And Jacques Cousteau admitted to them that his interest in oceanography really came from an obsession with finding Atlantis. Eventually, Ghislaine Maxwell would dive on sites. She was an expert diver. And she would helicopter pilot and so on and so forth. And she would dive on sites in the Bahamas area where there were believed to be Atlantean ruins, including she was trying to get permission from Fidel Castro, together with Epstein, to dive on a site on the western end of Cuba where Paulina Zalitsky, a Canadian oceanographic archaeologist, had found ruins of a vast Atlantean city.
Whoa.
This was roundabout in early 2010s. She mapped the whole thing with sonar. It wound up in a number of news stories. And I think at one point, National Geographic even said, this needs to be looked into. She goes, so this is a site off the western end of Cuba. In other words, it's right across from Yucatan. She suspects there's a connection to the ruins in Yucatan. So she goes to Mexico to investigate the connection. She's arrested in Mexico, severely intimidated by the authorities, and sent back to Canada. And she drops further investigations, and the story disappears from the media. Now, Ghislaine Maxwell went down to Cuba and met with Fidel Castro, together with Epstein, to get permission to dive on this site. So these people were interested in Atlantis. They were trying to breed Nordics, and they were interested in gravity, in conquering gravity. Therefore, I suspect that the interest in gravity is an interest in electrogravitics and, the Townsend Brown effect. And basically, it's all part of the UFO phenomenon that they're trying to crack.
Do you know who Peter Levenda is?
Sure.
He writes about this unholy alliance where he talks about the Nazis, sort of allying themselves with the tall whites of the Nordics, and there being some sort of secret technology trade.
I have an essay in that book, Lovers of Sophia, I mentioned earlier. It's an essay called Black Sunrise. It's about fascism. The whole essay is about the philosophy of fascism, and I cite Levenda a few times in that.
So do you think that, there's some sort of, this control system or whatever, and then they're allying themselves with different political factions and using them and discarding them sort of cyclically or something?
That's one way to read it.
Is there a connection between the eugenics of
That's
Nazis
one way to read it.
and whatever Epstein was doing?
There's definitely a connection. The question is, what's the connection? Here's the problem. If you look back at the 1950s contactees, and I lay this out in detail in Closer Encounters, and frankly, I'm appalled that UFO researchers don't talk about this. I mean, this is clear. It's clearly a taboo, and they don't have the backbone to honestly discuss this. George Van Tassel worked for Lockheed. George Van Tassel used to have Howard Hughes land on his private airstrip and come eat his wife's pies. He lived under this rock called Big Rock. I've been there.
Yeah, me too.
So you went to the Integratron?
Yeah.
This is cool.
And I've been to Big Rock.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this structure under the rock where George Van Tassel lived used to be owned by a Nazi called Frank Kreutzer. And he was confronted by the feds during World War II because they found out he's working for the Germans. So there's a standoff, and basically, long story short, Kreutzer's got a bunch of explosives in this place, and the feds close in on him. And whether he set them off or they shot at them, the place exploded, right? And Kreutzer's blood was splattered all over the walls. He dies. Van Tassel knew. Now, Kreutzer was involved in mining. In the mining interest, it looks like he was a forward operative for the Nazis, looking potentially to colonize California if they won the war or something like this. And he was involved in mining. Van Tassel knew Kreutzer. Van Tassel takes over the property from Kreutzer after his guts are, splayed all over the wall. And he moves his family into this. But first of all, what is the psychology of a person who moves his family into this Flintstone layer in which a Nazi exploded on the walls that they're looking at while they eat breakfast in the mornings, right?
Sure.
And this Van Tassel works for Lockheed, and Howard Hughes comes to that same underground layer, right, to eat Miss Van Tassel's pie. Okay. Now, what was George Van Tassel all about? What he tells us is that the entities from Venus, Nordics, of course, revealed to him that the human race comes from space, and when they got here, they found these hominids, ape-like people. And in the first expedition they sent to Earth, it was only men. Very 1950s, kind of view. You send the men first to establish the frontier and all this shit. Set up the, be the frontiersmen. But the problem is that when subsequent expeditions came together, that had women and they were actually intending to settle on a large scale, they found that the men who had been sent there as the forward explorers and frontier settlers wound up mating with the females from among the hominid population. And they had created these hybrids. They were basically quasi-human. And Van Tassel says, well, these are the lower races. The master race on the Earth are simply humans in their original form that come from space. And then there are all these other lower races that are a product of hybridization with a local hominid population. Now let's look at George Hunt Williamson. So George Hunt Williamson was It was a pseudonym. The guy's name was Mikhail Dobranovic, and he was actually from Serbian royalty. And this guy became George Adamski's handler. So he was helping Adamski edit all the stuff that Adamski published, and he had a precedence as an editor/handler for a magazine called Valor, which was the publication of William Dudley Pelley and the American Silver Shirts. These were fascists in the 1930s and into the 40s who wanted us to make an alliance with Germany instead of going to war with Hitler, to such an extent that William Dudley Pelley was eventually arrested and put in prison for basically collaboration with the enemy. When he was in prison, he wrote a book called Star Guests, and it created this religion called Soulcraft. And it's the same damn message as Van Tassel. The Nordic race came from space. They found inferior hominid life forms here. They interbred with them. It caused a fall in the level of human consciousness. We need to extricate ourselves from this through eugenics, et cetera, et cetera. Same racialist ideology. Then you look at George Adamski himself. Adamski says that these beings who come from both Mars and Venus and inhabit the whole solar system, whatever, he says, they're far more enlightened than us. They have a form of society where the government, religion, and science are not at all distinct from each other. And people are educated into the system from childhood. How wonderful. Sounds like a great society, right? The ultimate totalitarian system that you could imagine. And of course, they're all Nordics. And then last example I want to give, Billy Meyer. Also not really his name. I mean, his name was Edward Meyer. He got the name Billy when he was working in Tehran. The guy was 007. He was a James Bond-style super spy field intelligence operative.
Really?
Working primarily in the Middle East.
Billy Meyer.
Yeah. Until he had an accident in Turkey. In a bus accident, his arm was severed. And then he moved on to this property in Switzerland where he became an older man and he became the Billy Meyer that we associate with the contactee phenomenon.
I didn't know that.
I dug up this and have documented it all in Closer Encounters.
Whoa.
So Edward Meyer was working for somebody in the Middle East that gave him access to all of the Arab potentates. He met with all of the royalty in the Middle East. He had access to the court of the Shah of Iran. In particular, he was very close to the king of Jordan.
Billy Meyer.
Billy Meyer.
What?
And get this.
Context for the audience, Billy Meyer is a famous Swiss UFO researcher, ufologist, who in the 90s started to just take these amazing, like seemingly high-resolution photos of UFOs, attract all sorts of stuff. A lot of, intelligence, I think, became attracted to what was going on with him. And then he was sort of marginalized at the end of he's still alive, but,
Speaking of the photos, Jacques Vallee, because a lot of people have said, look, these photos are ridiculous. I mean, they're way too high resolution. They're way too, some look like, pots and pans, whatever held up. But Jacques Vallee has looked at some of these photos.
Yeah.
And his comment was that at least the best of them, he said, okay, they could be fake, and I think they were earlier than the 90s, some of these photos. He said at the time when they were taken, I think they were late 70s. In any case, Vallee's analysis, and remember, Jacques Vallee is living in Silicon Valley. He has access to a lot of tech people. I mean, he's a tech venture capitalist himself. He has access to a lot of people involved in also special effects and optical stuff. He knew Spielberg personally and worked with him, right?
Yeah.
And Vallee's assessment was that, they could be fake, but he would have needed access to ILM to fake these. And where did some guy living on a farm in Switzerland have the capability to fake some of these?
A super sophisticated.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, exactly. So this is where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
Is that the people who were involved with Billy Meyer in the years where he was acting as a super spy working in the Middle East say that he introduced these tall, very good-looking Nordic people to the Arab leaders in the Iran. And they would have meetings with these Arab kings and so forth on policy and what they were supposed to do. Now, few people know that Latin America was not the only area the Nazis were interested in after World War II. the reason why the Arab countries have a black, white, and red color scheme is that they got it from the Nazis. And a huge area that the Nazis were interested in was the Arab world.
Interesting.
After World War II. They embedded themselves deeply there. They were building V-2 rockets and the successor Scud missiles for Nasser and eventually for the Iraqis and so on and so forth. So now, this is a complicated argument, which, people have to actually dig into it in the book. I build off of research by Joseph Farrell to suggest that there was an international post-war Nazi network. Some people call Die Spinne, the spider.
Mm.
And that Eduard Meyer was an operative, high-level operative of this network. So point being, from Van Tassel to George Hunt Williamson, George Van Tassel, George Hunt Williamson, George Adamski, but what is it with George, by the way? Why are they all, what is that? Yeah, it's interesting. A whole other side interest of mine is Greater Iran and its history and, its cultural anthropology and so on and so forth. And in the Indo-European languages, the word George, Gorg, means wolf.
Mm.
And, at the end of World War II, the domestic resistance to the Allied occupation were called the werewolves.
That's right, the werewolf. And they would hide out underground often.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, these Georges. And, in the case of George Hunt Williamson, it was just a completely fake name. His name was Mikhail Dobranovic. In any case, whether it's Van Tassel, George Adamski, George Hunt Williamson, or Billy Meyer, it's all the same very racialist, Nordic, hierarchical caste system kind of narrative.
Mm.
And the question I have to ask is this, that when you now this is going on in the 50s, these contactee things start in the 50s and go through the 60s. We know that the breakthrough in aerospace propulsion at Martin Aircraft and potentially others was also in the mid-50s, where they were saying they can roll these things off an assembly line in 3 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if Epstein and company are trying to reverse engineer this technology or breed some kind of Nordics or whatever, they're very late to the game.
Mm.
You see?
Well,
so it makes me wonder.
Or it's a fly trap. It's a front for, funneling in scientists for something that is actually vital and has existed for years.
Quite possible. That's definitely one interpretation is it's a fly trap. It's an entry gate.
Mm-hmm.
It's a beacon.
Sure.
And then they're going to be funneled somewhere, just like the remote viewing program that we were told about, the SRI Stargate program, I said was shut down in 95, was really actually like a vestibule for a darker, deep black project that still exists, the one that, Pat Price was recruited into and killed over. So that's one possible interpretation. There's another interpretation, which is that scummy as he is, Jeffrey Epstein, and more importantly, Robert Maxwell and his daughter were part of a rebellion against this system. And they're trying to develop strategic competence and, something approaching parity with those who are actually running the breakaway civilization, that they were fielding their own enterprise.
That's not the vibe from all of them, is that they're being used by some power structure above them, would be my instinct.
It's quite possible.
But like just the back pattern.
I don't have a dog in the, I don't have a pony in the race,
Sure.
I don't know. But I'll tell you this, that the obsession with Atlantis is interesting in this regard, because Atlantis is a rebellion against the Olympian control system. So from the standpoint of people who want to maintain a hierarchical caste society with the devas or the Elohim or whatever at the top of it, valorizing Atlantis doesn't make very much sense. From that standpoint, to valorize Atlantis is satanic.
Yeah, you'd want it to nobody
right?
to even be thinking about.
That was the huge mistake we made that we should never make again, from that traditionalist, hierarchical, perennialist standpoint.
Yep.
So their obsession with Atlantis does suggest to me that maybe they saw themselves as being in competition
Mm.
And the other thing that suggests that to me is the fact that Jeffrey Epstein is dead and Ghislaine Maxwell is in prison.
Mm-hmm.
So that if these people were like lower level operatives for the people actually running the show, why did they meet with such ends?
Well, I think they would because they, a bunch of other powerful people want them dead.
Quite possible.
Yeah.
Including potentially the president of the United States.
Yeah, I think there are a whole host of really powerful people that wanted Epstein dead.
Yep.
But you also, speaking of the Nazi connection, you've uncovered, Whitley Strieber is this, really famous contactee, maybe the archetypal contactee in the 80s. He wrote Communion, of course, and he describes kind of ongoing relationship with gray aliens, just a whole host of crazy stories. He was on my podcast talking about how he has a hybrid child and stuff.
Yeah, I watched it.
Yeah, so there you go. So
you told him that you wanted one of the chips. I don't want one of the chips.
What do you mean one of the chips?
When he was showing you the chip in his ear.
I touched it.
You can touch it. You can't. I don't think you touch it if you want to.
I feel like 2 years.
I can give you a CT scan of it if you want
okay?
that.
Was it weird if I touch it, or is it okay?
No, it's fine. It doesn't matter. It might be a little hot because it's been working right here.
2-3 years ago, if you had told someone,
go ahead and touch it. Don't be scared. Here. It's right under my finger now.
Oh my God!
Yeah,
that is.
Can you touch it? I'll come touch you, but I want to finish this point because I feel like that's also
normal tissue.
Yeah.
No, it's not.
I mean, there's the CT scan, there's a video of the surgeon trying to remove it, and the thing fucking moving at its own, like it's
going
evaded
down
the
into my
surgeon.
earlobe. Yeah,
And it just like goes down. And I remember watching that.
I guess it went under. But that's the hard part. But it disappeared again.
exactly. It's actually moving now.
It went under.
It's on the run.
Well, it kind of is because I could see it just bright as day, and now it's. I don't see it.
Am I gonna have weird effects now that I?
No, not at all.
Yeah, you're like, yeah, cool, man. I want one of those. I don't want one of those.
I was messing around.
I don't want one of those.
I don't actually want one. Yeah, I'm good.
No, thank you.
No, same. I don't, and I don't want any weird contact either.
Certainly not from those folks.
No, definitely not. So what do you? Because you've talked about, he had these childhood experiences, right? In like Mexico City.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not uncovering anything that he didn't put in the public domain.
But there are things he doesn't want to talk about.
That's true. So I'll tell you what Whitley Strieber doesn't want to talk about.
Yeah.
Although he's, I'm basing it on statements he's publicly made, shows he's done over the years, going back 20 years.
Mm.
His father was involved with military intelligence, and they're Texas Germans. So this is also relevant, okay? The Strieber family are Texas Germans, and there were a lot of Germans in the United States. This is a long, deep subject. I can't go down that rabbit hole right now. But long story short, there were a lot of Germans in the United States in the lead up to World War II who were sympathetic to the Nazis and who helped to fund the rise of the Nazis.
Yeah, there was a rumor Hitler wanted to buy a house in the Pacific Palisades because there's this brown shirt cult by this guy, Erich Schmidt or whatever, all these sort of Nazi sympathizers.
They were all over the place.
Yeah.
And they were definitely in Texas.
Yeah.
And so Strieber's
Charles
father...
Lindbergh
absolutely.
Yeah.
Strieber's father was involved with military intelligence, and they enlisted him, his parents enlisted him at a summer camp at Randolph Air Force Base near their home in Texas, where Strieber alleges that he was subjected to various types of physical torture and mind control experiments, and that he was at one point taken from the summer camp at Randolph Air Force Base, which, by the way, his experiences there, he said, made him so ill that he was repeatedly absent from school as a child during a couple of years. And when he was 8 years old or something like that. And at one point, he was taken from the place, the base at Randolph Air Force, to a school for special children in Baja California. This is what he says. And this is what he don't want to talk about, where he says that they were taken to this place in Baja California, which he then, in his adulthood, went and tried to find. He drove around trying to find this mansion that they were taken to. And he says these little children were shown absolutely horrific things there, basically in some kind of dungeon. And, they were given chainsaws and various implements violence and made to believe that they were the ones who had carried out the horrific butchery that was displayed to them. And all kinds of horrific sounds were played to them in the dark. And it sounds like a precursor of MK Ultra, but involving children. The aim of which was to cause a fragmentation of the psyche and a kind of psychological dissociation that would make it possible for intelligence operatives to control a part of someone's mind that was not normally accessible to them. To compartmentalize a person's psyche and gain control over a certain backstage persona that could be activated for whatever purpose. And the other really disturbing thing in that context that Strieber recounted is that, and he left this out of Communion and out of the whole first series of books that he wrote about his close encounters, that when he encountered this gray, like sitting on top of him, like sitting astride him in a bed of a guest room in his cabin in the Catskills, as he managed to take his eyes off of her and look around the room.
He's engaging in relations
with
this gray.
Right.
Okay.
And he said he's never experienced anything more exciting in his life. Like, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So he's looking around the room, he can finally like get his eyes off of being glued to this entity. And he sees all these military and intelligence people standing around.
Whoa.
In the cabin.
Whoa.
He said, I recognized one of them. He was a guy I went to school with who later joined the CIA.
Wow.
And he was standing there together with like military people with like the brass. And so clearly some of Whitley Strieber's experiences are the product of a very advanced mind control program.
Right.
That's involved with the production of the UFO phenomenon or the management of the perception of it on some level.
Interesting. Well, it is interesting. He told me on the podcast as well, he met with James Jesus Angleton once. James Jesus Angleton, obviously.
Kennedy assassination.
Yeah, but ran counterintel for the CIA for 30, 40 years, and notorious Alan Dulles acolyte who would lie, cheat, and steal, and do all sorts of crazy sort of things. And he says that he asked Angleton if he could get recruited to the CIA, and Angleton was like, "No, not you. Like you can't get recruited or something." So maybe that is to your point that he was,
that's so dark. Like, if what Angleton was really thinking is, buddy, you're already an agent and you don't even know it.
Right.
Right.
Oh man, that's crazy. It's crazy. You can probably partition people or something.
That's certainly I mean, that was what, the Manchurian Candidate aspect of MK Ultra was about.
Yeah.
And they did that. And, I think probably Sirhan was an example of that.
I think so too, because he didn't really remember what had happened. And I think he was at the Santa Ana race. He was a big racehorse junkie or whatever. And then now you talk to RFK Jr., he'll say, my dad was not shot by him. He was shot by him, but from the back. He was also shot by a guy named Eugene Thanes Caesar,
who worked with Lockheed,
who was then a Skunk Works security guard. And the whole thing was set up by Bob Mayhew, who was general counsel for Howard Hughes.
Yeah.
Howard Hughes also probably being involved in JFK's assassination.
Sure.
So it's really this nuts kind of hidden.
Yeah, I mean, just because Sirhan was a product of MK Ultra doesn't mean that he was the lone assassin. It might mean he was meant to be a patsy in that operation.
Yeah, probably similar to Lee Harvey Oswald, who said, "I am a patsy."
Yeah.
And it's interesting that the ability to partition people, that's pretty crazy. I mean, there's a book called The Controllers by a guy named, I think, Martin Cannon. And apparently John Alexander threatened him when he wrote this book. Really? And it was about sending these messengers, these liaisons in intelligence contexts and partitioning them because they couldn't even have access to the information that they were carrying.
Very interesting.
It is interesting.
But you see, it doesn't really surprise me that that's possible because for a number of reasons. I mean, first of all, if you look at Nietzsche's understanding of the structure of the human psyche, and although he was a philosopher, it was the early days of psychology with William James and so forth, and really the emergence of psychology as a science from out of philosophy, like all of the previous sciences emerged from out of philosophy. And so Nietzsche sometimes would identify himself as a psychologist. And he has this very interesting account of how the human person is not really an individual. It's a conglomerate of sort of battling perspectives and warring drives. And these can aggregate in ways that, like, there's, 3 or 4 different people who really have found a way to live together inside somebody's head, right? And I believe that because of what I've seen in the course of researching reincarnation and possession. Right now, I'm doing a comprehensive study of the afterlife, death and reincarnation and possession phenomena, and the problematization of the distinction between reincarnation and possession. I don't know when this is going to be released, but at some point there'll be people watching this when the book is already out. I'm going to call it Thanosis, a contraction of Thanos, death, and gnosis, Thanosis. And in the course of this study of the afterlife, one thing I came across was that there are cases, of course, background, Ian Stevenson, Dr. Ian Stevenson studied, hundreds and hundreds of cases of children who spontaneously remembered past lives. He did this work at the University of Virginia for decades, from the 1960s through the 80s or something like that. And so there's a tremendous treasure trove of empirical data substantiating reincarnation in terms of the work that he did. And in particular, he's found cases that have interesting correlations between birthmarks and birth defects on the one hand and death wounds on the other. Anyway, if you take reincarnation seriously, as I think anyone should based on Stevenson's research, and then, you look more carefully at the data, you see that there are some cases where a single person reincarnated as 2 or more individuals. In other words, the psyche split in what Tibetans call the Bardo state, in the transition between death and rebirth. What was a singular person splits and is reincarnated as more than one individual.
Whoa.
One case of this that's very prominent is Terry and Linda Jameson. They're these identical twins who are also psychics, but they report having been the same person before they were separated at Earth, as they call it. And then you find possession cases where it looks like several individuals or more are reincarnating in a single physical body. Okay, where there have been Stephen Browdy, the former chair, philosophy department, University of Maryland, Baltimore, who then went on to become one of the presidents of the Parapsychological Association, and he was also the chief editor for the Journal of Scientific Exploration for a while, for the SSE. Steve Browdy touched on these in his first book, First Person Plural, which included a chapter about how there were cases of multiple personality disorder, or what they call identity dissociative disorder these days, which are misdiagnosed cases of basically multiple people incarnating in a single person or multiple people possessing a single person. Some of them from birth, and then some of them coming in after birth. Stevenson also has cases that problematize the distinction between reincarnation and possession, where let's say there'll be a child who will be deathly ill when he's 6 years old, and then when he comes back, to physical health, it's a completely different person with different memories. It's like the original kid did die, left the body, and somebody else came in and took over the body, right? Now, more than one person can come in, right? So here's the thing, is that what that suggests about the structure of personality, epistemologically speaking, is that we are not necessarily the unique, indivisible, self-identical individuals that we take ourselves to be. The psyche may have an internally differentiated structure, and it may be a conglomerate of different sub-personalities that find a modus vivendi with one another. And sometimes they hold together, crossing from one lifetime to the next, and in other cases, they break apart.
Yeah, and there probably is some way to systematically break that apart, compartmentalize.
That's where I was going with that. As MK Ultra, it's not all that surprising. If that's the way the psyche is structured anyway, then it becomes more easily understandable how it could be weaponized.
Well, it is interesting, MK Ultra, all the parapsychology research, all the kind of electrogravitic propulsion stuff, you're getting it, or even quantum communications, which Hal Puthoff is working on via these, vector and scalar potentials or whatever, the subquantum field. you're getting into modalities that if you were to dominate the human race, you would be able to employ all of these things at will. And so if you look at like the last 70 years of scientific research or something, yeah, it's kind of scary. It's like we are verging. Maybe it's the fallen angel thing, you know, where we're rebelliously sort of acquiring these skills. Or it's, you know, I don't know. Maybe it's, you know, you hear these like UFO, you know, whistleblower people. It's like Lou Elizondo will be like, we found the key and we're inside this cage and the gorilla sees that we have the key. So like it's this, you know, dark forest analogy, you know, spin-off thing that he's trying to say. And it's either that or it's like we're being inducted into some friendly thing. I don't know, but it is interesting. We're accelerating towards this new paradigm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you know, the gorilla, you mentioned the gorilla.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that whole test they do when they walk somebody in a gorilla suit through a group of people
You
doing
don't pay
something.
attention to it, yeah.
And the majority of people who watch the film don't notice the guy in the gorilla suit.
Yes.
And then when they were testing experimental aircraft, apparently, they would give gorilla masks to these people flying prototypes of the SR-71 and what do you call it? The other one that went down over Russia, the
U-2 spy
U-2, the U-2. Yeah. And they give these gorilla masks and they say to them, if you ever get too close to a civilian airliner where the pilot can make eye contact with you, put on the gorilla mask before that.
Yeah.
So that when they come back with a story about this weird-looking aircraft, they'll report it was a gorilla flying it, and no one will believe the story.
Yeah, it was in the
whole thing.
Annie Jacobson's Area 51. And that book, and I think we need to do like 5 more of these, but Annie Jacobson's Area 51 starts with, it tells that story, and it starts with the story of Bob Lazar. And I often wonder if the kind of true kind of hermeneutic reading of UFO disclosure is that there is some sort of co-sponsored, you know, program between the Nordics, I don't know what they are, and us, and they exist at these sites like Area 51 because you have these stories. First of all, Area 51 was a Nevada test site before it became Area 51. Richard Bissell set it up as Area 51 to test the U-2 spy plane in 1955. But you had already had hundreds of it was the site of the most atomic blasts in the United States. And UFOs constantly show up around, you know, nuclear weapons and energy installations. And so you'd think that if you have that many atomic blasts, you'd probably have created some sort of like portal or something. You even have this misty echo patch around a test from 1988. And it looks like there's a portal underground, and that would explain the Dan Barish story of S4 Area 51. It would explain some of the Bob Lazar stuff, and it would explain this weird disconnect of like, do we really have craft that can fly like that, and it's being employed by us? Well, maybe it's kind of, you know, being co-run by us and them, and that's this sort of electromagnetic wormhole portal pit stop for them or something. I don't know.
So 2 things about that.
Yeah.
2 things about that. First of all, something really creepy about UFOs and nukes.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, I devote, you know, good amount to this toward the beginning of Closer Encounters, that excellent book, Hastings book.
Bob Hastings.
Yeah, UFOs and I cited, you know, if not anything else, Closer Encounters is a good encyclopedic, like, index of references for the whole UFO research field. And Hastings is one of the people who I cite extensively in there. So, but here's something about UFOs and nukes that's really creepy. I have a Substack piece on this. It's called Nuking the Matrix on my Substack. The first person to ever propose that we could be living inside a computer simulation was a Nazi computer scientist by the name of Konrad Zuse. Konrad Zuse was the Alan Turing of the Nazis. He developed the first modern digital computers before Turing did. So people often give credit to Turing, but this guy was slightly ahead of Turing. And Turing was playing catch up with this guy. And this guy, Konrad Zuse, wasn't just involved in mechanical engineering of computers. He was extremely theoretical in his, you know, contemplation of what computation is. And it occurred to him for the first time that what if the weirdness in quantum mechanics is indicating the fact that we're living inside of what he called a calculating space, rechnender Raum, a calculating space. And he said the anomalies in our physics at the fundamental level are indicative of the fact that we're inside a computational system. And he theorized this whole thing during World War II. And here's the really creepy thing. he theorized that it would be possible to test this in extremely high entropy events, such as, for example, the detonation of a nuclear bomb.
Yes.
That a nuclear bomb's detonation is such a high entropy event that if you were observing the world on a quantum level during such an explosion, you would be able to detect basically the mesh of the matrix.
I agree. The only two ways out of the matrix are through consciousness and high energy physics. And if you even look at quantum indeterminacy, you have quantum indeterminacy between position and momentum, but you also have it between level of energy and time. So if you get extremely high energy output, you get time indeterminacy, and it explains weird portals at CERN, quote unquote, and stories around that. It explains high voltage experimentation of Tesla, Thomas Townsend Brown, both of them saying really weird things happen at high voltages across short distances. Tesla saying he saw the past, present, and future all in one and spoke to aliens, you know? And then you have nuclear blasts, which seem to, you get this sort of these weird time effects, and you see UFOs. And this is a bunch of Q-cleared guys who have literally no business lying about what they're seeing across all sorts of disparate sites across the United States. You have 167 Q-cleared employees saying that they see stuff in Bob Hastings' book.
And why is the only consistent thing that all of the Nordics have ever said that we need to disarm we need to disarm and relinquish our nuclear weapons, right? These Nordics, they tell all kinds of different stories to different people. The one through line is we need to relinquish our nuclear weapons.
That's how you get out of the matrix.
Yeah. See, people think they have these naive notions that, they're worried about the ecology of the planet and they want to stop us from destroying ourselves. Folks, there's evidence of nuclear exchanges in vast antiquity. I mean, there's vitrification at various ancient sites where there's also anomalous engineering. And as we discussed earlier, Brandenburg saw evidence of nuclear war on Mars. So it's not like these entities are, necessarily averse to the use of nuclear weapons on moral grounds. I think what's going on here is that it's a way that would reveal that we're inside the matrix. And they don't want us, maybe they know that. And it's very badly warped their psychology, having found that out. And their response to it was to create this control system, which at least gives them a sense of a degree of power.
Yeah.
Right? It's a very understandable human psychological response, actually. So you realize that, I don't have control over my life. I'm somebody else's plaything. Well, I'm going to create something that I do have control over.
Well, it's the whole three body problem where they're looking at the tip of the spear of human ingenuity, generically speaking. But yes, high energy experimentation would be kind of this Archimedes lever that you would sort of look at.
I have this case in Closer Encounters of a certain Sir Horsley. Sir Horsley was a British wing commander who became the closest aide and personal attaché of Queen Elizabeth I. And at that time, when he was, the personal aide of Queen Elizabeth as a military officer, he was approached by these Nordics who basically invited him to a fireside chat, Miss Markham and Mr. Janus. And they said, listen, we want you to come aboard. We want you to come aboard with our plans and our project. And we want you to help us disarm the world of nuclear weapons, beginning with your country, United Kingdom. This was in the 1950s when the British were first developing nuclear weapons. And he says that this Miss Markham, was a completely expressionless person. He said she looked like Lady Dracula. And she was like this completely expressionless, icy white person. And the only time she ever showed any emotion was when he came back at them with, well, wait a minute. If we disarm and the Soviets disarm, then if it turns out that you folks are up to no good, we're rendered entirely defenseless in the face of you. Our nuclear weapons are our only defense against you. And at that point, he says she had a wicked smile on her face looking at him. Well done, boy.
Whoa.
You figured us out. And anyway, he went and reported this back to the authorities. They investigated these people, and it turned out their flats were empty by the time the authorities got there.
Wow.
Okay? Now, here's really the most creepy thing about the story. The same Sir Horsley, 20 years later, wound up controlling the British nuclear arsenal. I think they knew that this guy was going to wind up in one of the most strategic positions regarding the British nuclear program. And they deliberately engaged him, having had foreknowledge of the further likely trajectory of his life.
So crazy. Well, Jason Reza Jorjani, this was a blast. We could honestly go for another 6 hours or something.
Maybe we will in LA next time.
Let's do it, man.
Next time you're back in Los Angeles.
Yeah, I would love that. I would love that. And so the new book you're writing, what's the name of it? Just
the one on the afterlife is going to be called Thanosis.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanosis, that's coming out.
And the book on UFOs is Closer Encounters.
Closer Encounters, Substack, Jason Reza Jorjani, and Prometheus and Atlas, of course. Thank you, man.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It was awesome.